Lukundoo by Edward Lucas White. It stands to reason, said Twombly, that a man must accept of his own eyes, and when eyes and ears agree there can be no doubt. He has to believe what he has both seen and heard. Not always, put in Singleton softly. Every man turned towards Singleton. Twombly was standing on hearthrug, his back to the grate, his legs spread out, with his habitual air of dominating the room. Singleton, as usual, was as much as possible effaced in a corner, but when Singleton spoke he said something. We faced him in that flattering spontaneity of expectant silence which invites utterance. "I was thinking," he said, after an interval, "of something I both saw and heard in Africa." Now, if there was one thing we had found impossible, it had been to elicit from Singleton anything definite about his African experiences. As with the alpinist in the story, who could tell only that he went up and came down, the sum of Singleton's revelations had been that he went there and came away. His words now riveted our attention at once. Twombly faded from the hearthrug, but not one of us could ever recall having seen him go. The room readjusted itself, focused on Singleton, and there was some hasty and furtive lighting of fresh cigars. Singleton lit one also, but it went out immediately, and he never relit it. Chapter 1. We were in the great forest, exploring for pygmies. Van Ryten had a theory that the dwarfs found by Stanley and others were a mere crossbreed between ordinary Negroes and the real pygmies. He hoped to discover a race of men 3 feet tall at most, or shorter. We had found no trace of any such beings. Natives were few, game scarce. Food, except game, there was none, and the deepest, dankest, drippingest forest all about. We were the only novelty in the country. No native we met had ever seen a white man before. Most had never heard of white men. All of a sudden, late one afternoon, there came into our camp an Englishman, and pretty well used up he was, too. We had heard no rumour of him. He had not only heard of us, but had made an amazing 5-day march to reach us. His guide and 2 bearers were nearly as done up as he. Even though he was in tatters and had 5 days' beard on, you could see he was naturally dapper and neat, and the sort of man to shave daily. He was small but wiry. His face was the sort of British face from which emotion has been so carefully banished that a foreigner is apt to think the wearer of the face incapable of any sort of feeling, the kind of face which, if it has any expression at all, expresses principally the resolution to go through the world decorously, without intruding upon or annoying anyone. His name was Etcham. He introduced himself modestly, and ate with us so deliberately that we should never have suspected, if our bearers had not had it from his bearers, that he had had but 3 meals in the 5 days, and those small. After we had lit up, he told us why he had come. "My chief is very seedy," he said between puffs. "He's bound to go out if he keeps this way. I thought perhaps—" He spoke quietly, in a soft, even tone, but I could see little beads of sweat oozing out on his upper lip under his stubby moustache, and there was a tingle of repressed emotion in his tone, a veiled eagerness in his eye, a palpitating inward solicitude in his demeanour that moved me at once. Van Ryten had no sentiment in him. If he was moved, he did not show it. But he listened. I was surprised at that. He was just the man to refuse at once. But he listened to Etcham's halting, difficult hints. He even asked questions. "Who is your chief?" "Stone," Etcham lisped. That electrified both of us. "Ralph Stone?" we ejaculated together. Etcham nodded. For some minutes Van Ryten and I were silent. Van Ryten had never seen him, but I had been a classmate of Stone's, and Van Ryten and I had discussed him over many a campfire. We had heard of him 2 years before, south of Luebo in the Balunda country, which had been ringing with his theatrical strife against a Balunda witch-doctor, ending in the sorcerer's complete discomfiture and the abasement of his tribe before Stone. They had even broken the fetish man's whistle and given Stone the pieces. It had been like the triumph of Elijah over the prophets of Baal, only more real to the Balunda. We had thought of Stone as far off, if still in Africa at all, and here he turned up ahead of us and probably forestalling our quest. Chapter 2. Etcham's naming of Stone brought back to us all his tantalizing story, his fascinating parents, their tragic death, the brilliance of his college days, the dazzle of his millions, the promise of his young manhood, his wide notoriety, so nearly real fame, his romantic elopement with a meteoric authoress whose sudden cascade of fiction had made her so great a name so young, whose beauty and charm was so much heralded, the frightful scandal of the breach of promise suit that followed, his bride's devotion through it all, their sudden quarrel after it was all over, their divorce, the too much advertised announcement of his approaching marriage to the plaintiff in the breach of promise suit, his precipitate remarriage to his divorced bride, their second quarrel and second divorce, his departure from his native land, his advent in the dark continent. The sense of all this rushed over me, and I believe Van Ryten felt it too, as he sat silent. Then he asked, "Where is Werner?" "Dead," said Etcham. "He died before I joined Stone." "You were not with Stone above Loebo?" "No, I joined him at Stanley Falls." "Who is with him?" "Only his Zanzibar servants and the bearers." "What sort of bearers?" "Mangbatu men," Etcham responded simply. Now, that impressed both Van Ryten and myself greatly. It bore out Stone's reputation as a notable leader of men. For up to that time no one had been able to use Mangbatu as bearers outside of their own country, or to hold them for long or difficult expeditions. "Were you long among the Mangbatu?" was Van Ryten's next question. "Some weeks," said Etcham. "Stone was interested in them, and made up a fair-sized vocabulary of their words and phrases. He had a theory that they're an offshoot of the Belunda, and he found much confirmation in their customs." "What do you live on?" Van Ryten inquired. "Game, mostly." "How long has Stone been laid up?" "More than a month." "And you've been hunting for the camp?" Etcham's face, burnt and flayed as it was, showed a flush. "I missed some easy shots," he admitted ruefully. "I've not felt very fit myself." "What's the matter with your chief?" "Something like carbuncles. He ought to get over a carbuncle or two." "They are not carbuncles. Nor one or two. He has had dozens, sometimes 5 at once. If they had been carbuncles, he would have been dead long ago, but in some ways they are not so bad, though in others they are worse." "How do you mean?" "Well, they do not seem to inflame so deep nor so wide as carbuncles, nor to be so painful, nor to cause so much fever. But then they seem to be part of a disease that affects his mind. He let me help him dress the first, but the others he has hidden most carefully from me and from the men. He keeps his tent when they puff up, and will not let me change the dressings or be with him at all." "Have you plenty of dressings?" "We have some, but he won't use them. He washes out the dressings and uses them over and over." "How is he treating the swellings?" "He slices them off clean down to flesh level with his razor." "What?" Etcham made no answer, but looked him steadily in the eyes. "I beg pardon," Van Ryten hastened to say. "You startled me. They can't be carbuncles. He'd have been dead long ago. I thought I had said they're not carbuncles. But the man must be crazy." "Just so. He's beyond my advice or control." "How many has he treated that way?" "2, to my knowledge." "2?" Etcham flushed again. "I saw him," he confessed, "through a crack in the hut. I felt impelled to keep a watch on him, as if he was not responsible." "I should think not. And you saw him do that twice?" "I conjecture that he did the like with all the rest." "How many has he had?" "Dozens." "Does he eat?" "Like a wolf. More than any 2 bearers." "Can he walk?" "He crawls a bit, groaning." "Little fever, you say?" "Enough, and too much." "Has he been delirious?" "Only twice. Once when the first swelling broke, and once later. He would not let anyone come near him then, but we could hear him talking steadily, and it scared the natives." "Was he talking their patter in delirium?" "No, but he was talking some similar lingo. Ahmad Burgash said he was talking Belunda. I know too little Belunda. I do not learn languages readily. Stone learned more Mangbatu in a week than I could have learned in a year, but I seem to hear words like Mangbatu words. Anyhow, the Mangbatu bearers were scared. Scared? So were the Zanzibar men, even Ahmed Burgash, and so was I, only for a different reason. He talked in two voices. In two voices, Van Ryten reflected. Yes, said Etcham, more excitedly than he had yet spoken. In two voices, like a conversation. One was his own, one a small, thin, bleaty voice like nothing I ever heard. I seemed to make out, among the sounds the deep voice made, something like Mangbatu words I knew as Nidru, Metababa, and Nido, their terms for head, shoulder, thigh, and perhaps Kudra and Nakeri, speak and whistle, and among the noises of the shrill voice, Matamipa, Angunzi, and Kamamami, kill, death, and hate. Ahmed Burgash said he also heard those words. He knew Mangbatu far better than I. What did the bearers say? Van Ryten asked. They said, Lukundoo. I did not know the word. Ahmed Burgash said it was Mangbatu for leopard. It's Mangbatu for witchcraft, said Van Ryten. I don't wonder they thought so. It was enough to make one believe in sorcery to listen to those two voices. One voice answering the other? Van Ryten asked perfunctorily. Etcham's face went grey under his tan. Sometimes both at once, he answered huskily. Both at once? It sounded that way to the men too, and that was not all. He stopped and looked helplessly at us for a moment. Could a man talk and whistle at the same time? How do you mean? We could hear Stone talking away, his big, deep-cheated baritone rumbling along, and through it all we could hear a high, shrill whistle, the oddest, wheezy sound. You know, no matter how shrilly a grown man may whistle, the note has a different quality from the whistle of a boy or a woman or a little girl. They sound more treble somehow. Well, if you can imagine the smallest girl who could whistle keeping it up tunelessly right along, that whistle was like that, only even more piercing, and it sounded right through Stone's bass tones. And you didn't go to him? He is not given to threats. But he had threatened, not volubly nor like a sick man, but quietly and firmly, that if any man of us, he lumped me in with the men, came near him while he was in his trouble, that man should die. And it was not so much his words as his manner. It was like a monarch commanding respected privacy for a deathbed. One simply could not transgress. I see, said Van Ryten shortly. He's very seedy, Etcham repeated helplessly. I thought, perhaps... His absorbing affection for Stone, his real love for him, shone out through his envelope of conventional training. Worship of Stone was plainly his master passion. Like many competent men, Van Ryten had a streak of hard selfishness in him. It came to the surface then. He said we carried our lives in our hands from day to day just as genuinely as Stone, that he did not forget the ties of blood and calling between any two explorers, but that there was no sense in imperiling one party for a very problematical benefit to a man probably beyond any help, that it was enough of a task to hunt for one party, that if two were united, providing food would be more than doubly difficult, that the risk of starvation was too great. Deflecting our march 7 full days' journey, he complimented Etcham on his marching powers, might ruin our expedition entirely. Chapter 3. Van Ryten had logic on his side, and he had a way with him. Etcham sat there, apologetic and deferential, like a fourth-form schoolboy before a headmaster. Van Ryten wound up. I'm after pygmies at the risk of my life. After pygmies I go. Perhaps, then, these will interest you, said Etcham, very quietly. He took 2 objects out of the side pocket of his blouse and handed them to Van Ryten. They were round, bigger than big plums, and smaller than small peaches, about the right size to enclose in an average hand. They were black, and at first I did not see what they were. Pygmies! Van Ryten exclaimed. Pygmies indeed! Why, they wouldn't be 2 feet high! Do you mean to claim that these are adult heads? I claim nothing, Etcham answered evenly. You can see for yourself. Van Ryten passed one of the heads to me. The sun was just setting, and I examined it closely. A dried head it was, perfectly preserved, and the flesh as hard as Argentine jerked beef. A bit of a vertebra stuck out where the muscles of the vanished neck had shriveled into folds. The puny chin was sharp on a projecting jaw, the minute teeth white and even between the retracted lips. The tiny nose was flat, the little forehead retreating. There were inconsiderable clumps of stunted wool on the Lilliputian cranium. There was nothing babyish, childish, or youthful about the head. Rather, it was mature to senility. Where did these come from? Van Ryten inquired. I do not know, Etchem replied precisely. I found them among Stone's effects while rummaging for medicines or drugs or anything that could help me to help him. I do not know where he got them, but I'll swear he did not have them when we entered this district. Are you sure? Van Ryten queried, his eyes big and fixed on Etchem's. Very sure. But how could he have come by them without your knowledge? Sometimes we were apart 10 days at a time hunting. Stone is not a talking man. He gave me no account of his doings, and Ahmed Burgash keeps a still tongue and a tight hold on the men. You have examined these heads? Minutely. Van Ryten took out his notebook. He was a methodical chap. He tore out a leaf, folded it, and divided it equally into 3 pieces. He gave one to me and one to Etchem. Just for a test of my impressions, he said. I want each of us to write separately just what he is most reminded of by these heads. Then I want to compare the writings. I handed Etchem a pencil, and he wrote. Then he handed the pencil back to me, and I wrote. Read the 3, said Van Ryten, handing me his piece. Van Ryten had written, An old Balunda witch doctor. Etchem had written, An old Mangbatu fetish man. I had written, An old Katongo magician. There! Van Ryten exclaimed. Look at that! There is nothing Wagabi or Batwa or Wambatu or Wabotu about these heads, nor anything pygmy either. I thought as much, said Etchem. And you say he did not have them before? To a certainty he did not. It is worth following up, said Van Ryten. I'll go with you, and first of all, I'll do my best to save Stone. He put out his hand, and Etchem clasped it silently. He was grateful all over. Chapter 4. Nothing but Etchem's fever of solicitude could have taken him in 5 days over the track. It took him 8 days to retrace with full knowledge of it, and our party to help. We could not have done it in 7, and Etchem urged us on, in a repressed fury of anxiety, no mere fever of duty to his chief, but a real ardour of devotion, a glow of personal adoration for Stone which blazed under his dry conventional exterior, and showed in spite of him. We found Stone well cared for. Etchem had seen to a good high-thorn zareba round the camp. The huts were well built and thatched, and Stone's was as good as their resources would permit. Ahmed Burgash was not named after 2 Saids for nothing. He had in him the making of a sultan. He had kept the Mangbatu together, not a man had slipped off, and he had kept them in order. Also, he was a deft nurse and a faithful servant. The 2 other Zanzibaris had done some creditable hunting. Though all were hungry, the camp was far from starvation. Stone was on a canvas cot, and there was a sort of collapsible camp stool table, like a Turkish tabouret, by the cot. It had a water bottle and some vials on it, and Stone's watch, also his razor in its case. Stone was clean and not emaciated, but he was far gone. Not unconscious, but in a daze, past commanding or resisting anyone. He did not seem to see us enter, or to know we were there. I should have recognized him anywhere. His boyish dash and grace had vanished utterly, of course. But his head was even more leonine. His hair was still abundant, yellow and wavy. The close, crisp blonde beard he had grown during his illness did not alter him. He was big and big-cheated yet. His eyes were dull, and he mumbled and babbled mere meaningless syllables, not words. Etchem helped Van Ryten to uncover him and look him over. He was in good muscle for a man so long bedridden. There were no scars on him except about his knees, shoulders, and chest. On each knee and above it he had a full score of roundish cicatrices, and a dozen or more on each shoulder, all in front. 2 or 3 were open wounds, and 4 or 5 barely healed. He had no fresh swellings, except 2, one on each side on his pectoral muscles, the one on the left being higher up and farther out than the other. They did not look like boils or carbuncles, but as if something blunt and hard were being pushed up through the fairly healthy flesh and skin, not much inflamed. "I should not lance those," said Van Ryten, and Etcham assented. They made Stone as comfortable as they could, and just before sunset we looked in at him again. He was lying on his back, and his chest showed big and massive yet, but he lay as if in a stupor. We left Etcham with him and went into the next hut, which Etcham had resigned to us. The jungle noises were no different than anywhere else for months past, and I was soon fast asleep. Chapter 5. Sometime in the pitch dark I found myself awake and listening. I could hear two voices, one Stone's, the other sibilant and wheezy. I knew Stone's voice after all the years that had passed since I heard it last. The other was like nothing I remembered. It had less volume than the wail of a newborn baby, yet there was an insistent carrying power to it, like the shrilling of an insect. As I listened, I heard Van Ryten breathing near me in the dark. Then he heard me and realized that I was listening too. Like Etcham, I knew little Belander, but I could make out a word or two. The voices alternated, with intervals of silence between. Then suddenly both sounded at once and fast. Stone's baritone basso, full as if he were in perfect health, and that incredibly stridulous falsetto, both jabbering at once like the voices of two people quarrelling and trying to talk each other down. "I can't stand this," said Van Ryten. "Let's have a look at him." He had one of those cylindrical electric night candles. He fumbled about for it, touched the button, and beckoned me to come with him. Outside the hut, he motioned me to stand still, and instinctively turned off the light, as if seeing made listening difficult. Except for a faint glow from the embers of the bearer's fire, we were in complete darkness. Little starlight struggled through the trees. The river made but a faint murmur. We could hear the two voices together, and then suddenly the creaking voice changed into a razor-edged, slicing whistle, indescribably cutting, continuing right through Stone's grumbling torrent of croaking words. "Good God!" exclaimed Van Ryten. Abruptly he turned on the light. We found Etcham utterly asleep, exhausted by his long anxiety and the exertions of his phenomenal march, and relaxed completely, now that the load was in a sense shifted from his shoulders to Van Ryten's. Even the light on his face did not wake him. The whistle had ceased, and the two voices now sounded together. Both came from Stone's cot, where the concentrated white ray showed him lying just as we had left him, except that he had tossed his arms above his head and had torn the coverings and bandages from his chest. The swelling on his right breast had broken. Van Ryten aimed the center line of the light at it, and we saw it plainly. From his flesh, grown out of it, there protruded a head, such a head as the dried specimens Etcham had shown us, as if it were a miniature of the head of a Belander fetish man. It was black, shining black as the blackest African skin. It rolled the whites of its wicked wee eyes and showed its microscopic teeth between lips repulsively negroid in their red fullness, even in so diminutive a face. It had crisp, fuzzy wool on its minikin skull. It turned malignantly from side to side and chittered incessantly in that inconceivable falsetto. Stone babbled brokenly against its patter. Van Ryten turned from Stone and waked Etcham, with some difficulty. When he was awake and saw it all, Etcham stared and said not one word. "You saw him slice off 2 swellings?" Van Ryten asked. Etcham nodded chokingly. "Did he bleed much?" "Very little." "You hold his arms." He took up Stone's razor and handed me the light. Stone showed no sign of seeing the light or of knowing we were there, but the little head mewed and screeched at us. Van Ryten's hand was steady, and the sweep of the razor even and true. Stone bled amazingly little, and Van Ryten dressed the wound as if it had been a bruise or scrape. Stone had stopped talking the instant the excrescent head was severed. Van Ryten did all that could be done for Stone, and then fairly grabbed the light from me. Snatching up a gun, he scanned the ground by the cot and brought the butt down once and twice, viciously. We went back to our hut, but I doubt if I slept. Chapter 6. Next day, near noon, in broad daylight, we heard the 2 voices from Stone's hut. We found Etcham dropped asleep by his charge. The swelling on the left had broken, and just such another head was there, mewling and spluttering. Etcham woke up, and the 3 of us stood there and glared. Stone interjected hoarse vocables into the tinkling gurgle of the portent's utterance. Van Ryten stepped forward, took up Stone's razor, and knelt down by the cot. The atomy of a head squealed a wheezy snarl at him. Then suddenly Stone spoke English. "Who are you with my razor?" Van Ryten started back and stood up. Stone's eyes were clear now and bright. They roved about the hut. "The end," he said. "I recognize the end. I seem to see Etcham, as if in life, but Singleton, Singleton! Ghosts of my boyhood come to watch me pass, and you, strange spectre with the black beard and my razor. Right ye all!" "I'm no ghost, Stone," I managed to say. "I'm alive. So are Etcham and Van Ryten. We're here to help you." "Van Ryten," he exclaimed. "My work passes on to a better man. Luck go with you, Van Ryten." Van Ryten went nearer to him. "Just hold still a moment, old man," he said soothingly. "It will be only one twinge." "I've held still for many such twinges," Stone answered quite distinctly. "Let me be. Let me die in my own way. The Hydra was nothing to this. You can cut off 10, 100, 1,000 heads, but the curse you cannot cut off, or take off. What's soaked into the bone won't come out of the flesh, any more than what's bred there. Don't hack me any more. Promise." His voice had all the old commanding tone of his boyhood, and it swayed Van Ryten as it always had swayed everybody. "I promise," said Van Ryten. Almost as he said the word, Stone's eyes filmed again. Then we 3 sat about Stone and watched that hideous, gibbering prodigy grow up out of Stone's flesh, till 2 horrid, spindling little black arms disengaged themselves. The infinitesimal nails were perfect to the barely perceptible moon at the quick. The pink spot on the palm was horridly natural. These arms gesticulated, and the right plucked towards Stone's blonde beard. "I can't stand this," Van Ryten exclaimed, and took up the razor again. Instantly Stone's eyes opened, hard and glittering. "Van Ryten break his word?" he enunciated slowly. "Never! But we must help you. I am past all help and all hurting. This is my hour. This curse is not put on me. It grew out of me like this horror here. Even now I go." His eyes closed and we stood helpless, the adherent figure spouting shrill sentences. In a moment, Stone spoke again. "You speak all tongues?" he asked quickly. And the merchant Minnikin replied in sudden English, "Yeah, verily all that you speak," putting out its microscopic tongue, writhing its lips and wagging its head from side to side. We could see the thready ribs on its exiguous flanks heave, as if the thing breathed. "Has she forgiven me?" Stone asked in a muffled strangle. "Not while the moss hangs from the cypresses. Not while the stars shine on Lake Pontchartrain will she forgive." And then Stone, all with one motion, wrenched himself over on his side. The next instant, he was dead. When Singleton's voice ceased, the room was hushed for a space. We could hear each other breathing. Toowoomble, the tactless, broke the silence. "I presume," he said, "you cut off the little Minnikin and brought it home in alcohol." Singleton turned on him a stern countenance. "We buried Stone," he said, "unmutilated as he died." "But," said the unconscionable Toowoomble, "the whole thing is incredible." Singleton stiffened. "I did not expect you to believe it," he said. "I began by saying that although I heard and saw it, when I look back on it, I cannot credit it myself." The Interlopers by Saki. In a forest of mixed growth, somewhere on the eastern spurs of the Carpathians, A man stood one winter night, watching and listening, as though he waited for some beast of the woods to come within the range of his vision, and later of his rifle. But the game for whose presence he kept so keen an outlook was none that figured in the sportsman's calendar as lawful and proper for the chase. Ulrich von Gradwitz patrolled the dark forest in quest of a human enemy. The forest lands of Gradwitz were of wide extent and well stocked with game. The narrow strip of precipitous woodland that lay on its outskirt was not remarkable for the game it harbored or the shooting it afforded, but it was the most jealously guarded of all its owner's territorial possessions. A famous lawsuit in the days of his grandfather had wrested it from the illegal possession of a neighboring family of petty landowners. The dispossessed party had never acquiesced in the judgment of the courts, and a long series of poaching affrays and similar scandals had embittered the relationships between the families for 3 generations. The neighbor feud had grown into a personal one, since Ulrich had come to be head of his family. If there was a man in the world whom he detested and wished ill to, it was Georg Znaeum, the inheritor of the quarrel and the tireless game-snatcher and raider of the disputed border forest. The feud might, perhaps, have died down or been compromised if the personal ill will of the 2 men had not stood in the way. As boys they had thirsted for one another's blood. As men each prayed that misfortune might fall on the other. And this wind-scourged winter night Ulrich had banded together his foresters to watch the dark forest, not in quest of 4-footed quarry, but to keep a lookout for the prowling thieves whom he suspected of being afoot from across the land boundary. The roebuck, which usually kept in the sheltered hollows during a storm wind, were running like driven things tonight, and there was movement and unrest among the creatures that were wont to sleep through the dark hours. Assuredly there was a disturbing element in the forest, and Ulrich could guess the quarter from whence it came. He strayed away by himself from the watchers whom he had placed in ambush on the crest of the hill, and wandered far down the steep slopes amid the wild tangle of undergrowth, peering through the tree trunks and listening through the whistling and skirling of the wind, and the restless beating of the branches for sight and sound of the marauders. If only on this wild night, in this dark lone spot, he might come across Georg Znaeum, man to man with none to witness. That was the wish that was uppermost in his thoughts. And as he stepped round the trunk of a huge beech, he came face to face with the man he sought. The 2 enemies stood glaring at one another for a long, silent moment. Each had a rifle in his hand. Each had hate in his heart and murder uppermost in his mind. The chance had come to give full play to the passions of a lifetime. But a man who has been brought up under the code of a restraining civilization cannot easily nerve himself to shoot down his neighbor in cold blood and without word spoken, except for an offense against his hearth and honor. And before the moment of hesitation had given way to action, a deed of nature's own violence overwhelmed them both. A fierce shriek of the storm had been answered by a splitting crash over their heads, and ere they could leap aside, a mass of falling beech tree had thundered down on them. Ulrich von Gradwitz found himself stretched on the ground, one arm numb beneath him and the other held almost as helplessly in a tight tangle of forked branches, while both legs were pinned beneath the fallen mass. His heavy shooting boots had saved his feet from being crushed to pieces, but if his fractures were not as serious as they might have been, at least it was evident that he could not move from his present position till someone came to release him. The descending twig had slashed the skin of his face, and he had to wink away some drops of blood from his eyelashes before he could take in a general view of the disaster. At his side, so near that under ordinary circumstances he could almost have touched him, lay Georg Znaeum, alive and struggling, but obviously as helplessly pinioned down as himself. All round them lay a thick-strewn wreckage of splintered branches and broken twigs. Relief at being alive and exasperation at his captive plight brought a strange medley of pious thank-offerings and sharp curses to Ulrich's lips. Georg, who was nearly blinded with the blood which trickled across his eyes, stopped his struggling for a moment to listen, and then gave a short, snarling laugh. So you're not killed as you ought to be, but you're caught anyway, he cried. Caught fast. Oh, what a jest. Ulrich von Gradwitz snared in his stolen forest. There's real justice for you. And he laughed again, mockingly and savagely. I'm caught in my own forest land, retorted Ulrich. When my men come to release us, you will wish, perhaps, that you were in a better plight than caught poaching on a neighbour's land. Shame on you! Georg was silent for a moment. Then he answered quietly. Are you sure that your men will find much to release? I have men too in the forest tonight, close behind me, and they will be here first and do the releasing. When they drag me out from under these damned branches, it won't need much clumsiness on their part to roll this massive trunk right over on the top of you. Your men will find you dead under a fallen beech tree. For form's sake, I shall send my condolences to your family. It is a useful hint, said Ulrich fiercely. My men had orders to follow in 10 minutes' time, 7 of which must have gone by already. And when they get me out, I will remember the hint. Only as you will have met your death poaching on my lands, I don't think I can decently send any message of condolence to your family. Good, snarled Georg. Good. We fight this quarrel out to the death, you and I and our foresters, with no cursed interlopers to come between us. Death and damnation to you, Ulrich von Gradwitz. The same to you, Georg Zeneum, forest thief, game snatcher. Both men spoke with the bitterness of possible defeat before them, for each knew that it might be long before his men would seek him out or find him. It was a bare matter of chance which party would arrive first on the scene. Both had now given up the useless struggle to free themselves from the mass of wood that held them down. Ulrich limited his endeavours to an effort to bring his one partially free arm near enough to his outer coat pocket to draw out his wine flask. Even when he had accomplished that operation, it was long before he could manage the unscrewing of the stopper or get any of the liquid down his throat. But what a heaven-sent draught it seemed. It was an open winter, and little snow had fallen as yet. Hence the captives suffered less from the cold than might have been the case at that season of the year. Nevertheless, the wine was warming and reviving to the wounded man, and he looked across with something like a throb of pity to where his enemy lay, just keeping the groans of pain and weariness from crossing his lips. "Could you reach this flask if I threw it over to you?" asked Ulrich suddenly. "There is good wine in it, and one may as well be as comfortable as one can. Let us drink, even if tonight one of us dies." "No, I could scarcely see anything. There is so much blood caked round my eyes," said Georg. "And in any case, I don't drink wine with an enemy." Ulrich was silent for a few minutes, and lay listening to the weary screeching of the wind. An idea was slowly forming and growing in his brain, an idea that gained strength every time that he looked across at the man who was fighting so grimly against pain and exhaustion. In the pain and languor that Ulrich himself was feeling, the old fierce hatred seemed to be dying down. "Neighbour," he said presently, "do as you please if your men come first. It was a fair compact. But as for me, I've changed my mind. If my men are the first to come, you shall be the first to be helped, as though you were my guest. We have quarrelled like devils all our lives over this stupid strip of forest where the trees can't even stand upright in a breath of wind. Lying here tonight, thinking, I come to think we've been rather fools. There are better things in life than getting the better of a boundary dispute. Neighbour, if you will help me to bury the old quarrel, I will ask you to be my friend." Georg Zeneum was silent for so long that Ulrich thought, perhaps, he had fainted with the pain of his injuries. Then he spoke slowly and in jerks. "How the whole region would stare and gabble if we rode into the market square together. No one living can remember seeing a Zeneum and a von Gradwitz talking to one another in friendship. And what peace there would be among the forester folk if we ended our feud tonight. And if we chose to make peace among our people, there is none other to interfere, no interlopers from outside. You would come and keep the Sylvester night beneath my roof, and I would come and feast on some high day at your castle. I would never fire a shot on your lands, save when you invited me as a guest. And you should come and shoot with me down in the marshes, where the wildfowl are. In all the countryside there are none that could hinder if we willed to make peace. I never thought to have wanted to do other than hate you all my life, but I think I've changed my mind about things too this last half hour, and you offered me a wine flask. Ulrich von Gradwitz, I will be your friend." For a space both men were silent, turning over in their minds the wonderful changes that this dramatic reconciliation would bring about. In the cold, gloomy forest, with the wind tearing in fitful gusts through the naked branches and whistling round the tree trunks, they lay and waited for the help that would now bring release and succour to both parties, and each prayed a private prayer that his men might be the first to arrive, so that he might be the first to show honourable attention to the enemy that had become a friend. Presently, as the wind dropped for a moment, Ulrich broke silence. "Let's shout for help," he said. "In this lull our voices may carry a little way." "They won't carry far through the trees and undergrowth," said Georg, "but we can try. Together, then." The two raised their voices in a prolonged hunting call. "Together again," said Ulrich a few minutes later, after listening in vain for an answering halloo. "I heard nothing but the pestilential wind," said Georg hoarsely. There was silence again for some minutes, and then Ulrich gave a joyful cry. "I can see figures coming through the wood. They're following in the way I came down the hillside." Both men raised their voices in as loud a shout as they could muster. "They hear us! They've stopped! Now they see us! They're running down the hill towards us! How many of them are there?" "I can't see distinctly. 9 or 10. "Then they are yours. I had only 7 out with me." "They're making all the speed they can. Brave lads." "Are they your men?" asked Georg. "Are they your men?" he repeated impatiently as Ulrich did not answer. "No," said Ulrich with a laugh, the idiotic chattering laugh of a man unstrung with hideous fear. "Who are they?" asked Georg quickly, straining his eyes to see what the other would gladly not have seen. "Wolves." The Death of Halpin Frayser by Ambrose Bierce. 1. For by death is wrought greater change than hath been shown, whereas in general the spirit that removed cometh back upon occasion, and is sometimes seen of those in flesh, appearing in the form of the body it bore, yet it hath happened that the veritable body without the spirit hath walked. And it is attested of those encountering who have lived to speak thereon, that a lich so raised up hath no natural affection, nor remembrance thereof, but only hate. Also it is known that some spirits which in life were benign, become by death evil altogether. Harley. One dark night in midsummer, a man waking from a dreamless sleep in a forest lifted his head from the earth, and staring a few moments into the blackness, said, "Catherine Leroux." He said nothing more. No reason was known to him why he should have said so much. The man was Halpin Frayser. He lived in St. Helena, but where he lives now is uncertain, for he is dead. One who practices sleeping in the woods with nothing under him but the dry leaves and the damp earth, and nothing over him but the branches from which the leaves have fallen and the sky from which the earth has fallen, cannot hope for great longevity, and Frayser had already attained the age of 32. There are persons in this world, millions of persons, and far and away the best persons, who regard that as a very advanced age. They are the children. To those who view the voyage of life from the port of departure, the bark that has accomplished any considerable distance appears already in close approach to the farther shore. However, it is not certain that Halpin Frayser came to his death by exposure. He had been all day in the hills west of the Napa Valley, looking for doves and such small game as was in season. Late in the afternoon it had come on to be cloudy, and he had lost his bearings, and although he had only to go always downhill, everywhere the way to safety when one is lost, the absence of trails had so impeded him that he was overtaken by night while still in the forest. Unable in the darkness to penetrate the thickets of manzanita and other undergrowth, utterly bewildered and overcome with fatigue, he had lain down near the root of a large madroño and fallen into a dreamless sleep. It was hours later, in the very middle of the night, that one of God's mysterious messengers, gliding ahead of the incalculable host of his companions, sweeping westward with the dawn line, pronounced the awakening word in the ear of the sleeper, who sat upright and spoke, he knew not why, a name he knew not whose. Halpin Frayser was not much of a philosopher, nor a scientist. The circumstance that, waking from a deep sleep at night in the midst of a forest, he had spoken aloud a name that he had not in memory and hardly had in mind, did not arouse an enlightened curiosity to investigate the phenomenon. He thought it odd, and with a little perfunctory shiver, as if in deference to a seasonal presumption that the night was chill, he lay down again and went to sleep. But his sleep was no longer dreamless. He thought he was walking along a dusty road that showed white in the gathering darkness of a summer night. Whence and whither it led, and why he travelled it, he did not know, though all seemed simple and natural, as is the way in dreams. For in the land beyond the bed surprises cease from troubling, and the judgment is at rest. Soon he came to a parting of the ways. Leading from the highway was a road less travelled, having the appearance, indeed, of having been long abandoned, because, he thought, it led to something evil. Yet he turned into it without hesitation, impelled by some imperious necessity. As he pressed forward, he became conscious that his way was haunted by invisible existences whom he could not definitely figure to his mind. From among the trees on either side he caught broken and incoherent whispers in a strange tongue which yet he partly understood. They seemed to him fragmentary utterances of a monstrous conspiracy against his body and soul. It was now long after nightfall, yet the interminable forest through which he journeyed was lit with a wan glimmer, having no point of diffusion, for in its mysterious illumination nothing cast a shadow. A shallow pool in the gutted depression of an old wheel rut, as from a recent rain, met his eye with a crimson gleam. He stooped and plunged his hand into it. It stained his fingers. It was blood. Blood, he then observed, was about him everywhere. The weeds growing rankly by the roadside showed it in blots and splashes on their big, broad leaves. Patches of dry dust between the wheelways were pitted and spattered as with a red rain. Defiling the trunks of the trees were broad maculations of crimson, and blood dripped like dew from their foliage. All this he observed with a terror which seemed not incompatible with the fulfillment of a natural expectation. It seemed to him that it was all in expiation of some crime which, though conscious of his guilt, he could not rightly remember. To the menaces and mysteries of his surroundings, the consciousness was an added horror. Vainly he sought, by tracing life backward in memory, to reproduce the moment of his sin. Scenes and incidents came crowding tumultuously into his mind, one picture effacing another, or commingling with it in confusion and obscurity, but nowhere could he catch a glimpse of what he sought. The failure augmented his terror. He felt as one who was murdered in the dark, not knowing whom nor why. So frightful was the situation. The mysterious light burned with so silent and awful a menace. The noxious plants, the trees that by common consent are invested with a melancholy or baleful character, so openly in his sight conspired against his peace. From overhead and all about came so audible and startling whispers, and the sighs of creatures so obviously not of earth, that he could endure it no longer, and with a great effort to break some malign spell that bound his faculties to silence and inaction, he shouted with the full strength of his lungs. His voice broke, and it seemed, into an infinite multitude of unfamiliar sounds, went babbling and stammering away into the distant reaches of the forest, died into silence, and all was as before. But he had made a beginning at resistance, and was encouraged. He said, "I will not submit unheard. There may be powers that are not malignant travelling this accursed road. I shall leave them a record and an appeal. I shall relate my wrongs, the persecutions that I endure. I, a helpless mortal, a penitent and unoffending poet." Halpin Frayser was a poet only as he was a penitent. In his dream, taking from his clothing a small red leather pocket-book, one half of which was leaved for memoranda, he discovered that he was without a pencil. He broke a twig from a bush, dipped it into a pool of blood, and wrote rapidly. He had hardly touched the paper with the point of his twig when a low, wild peal of laughter broke out at a measureless distance away, and growing ever louder, seemed approaching ever nearer, a soulless, heartless, and unjoyous laugh, like that of the loon, solitary by the lakeside at midnight, a laugh which culminated in an unearthly shout close at hand, then died away by slow gradations, as if the accursed being that uttered it had withdrawn over the verge of the world whence it had come. But the man felt that this was not so, that it was nearby and had not moved. A strange sensation began slowly to take possession of his body and his mind. He could not have said which, if any, of his senses was affected. He felt it rather as a consciousness, a mysterious mental assurance of some overpowering presence, some supernatural malevolence, different in kind from the invisible existences that swarmed about him and superior to them in power. He knew that it had uttered that hideous laugh, and now it seemed to be approaching him from what direction he did not know, dared not conjecture. All his former fears were forgotten or merged in the gigantic terror that now held him in thrall. Apart from that, he had but one thought, to complete his written appeal to the benign powers who, traversing the haunted wood, might sometime rescue him if he should be denied the blessing of annihilation. He wrote with terrible rapidity, the twig in his fingers rilling blood without renewal. But in the middle of a sentence his hands denied their service to his will, his arms fell to his sides, the book to the earth, and powerless to move or cry out, he found himself staring into the sharply drawn face and blank dead eyes of his own mother, standing white and silent in the garments of the grave. 2. In his youth, Halpin Frayser had lived with his parents in Nashville, Tennessee. The Fraysers were well-to-do, having a good position in such society as had survived the wreck wrought by civil war. Their children had the social and educational opportunities of their time and place, and had responded to good associations and instruction with agreeable manners and cultivated minds. Halpin, being the youngest and not over-robust, was perhaps a trifle spoiled. He had the double disadvantage of a mother's assiduity and a father's neglect. Frayser Peer was what no Southern man of means is not, a politician. His country, or rather his section and state, made demands upon his time and attention so exacting that to those of his family he was compelled to turn an ear partly deafened by the thunder of the political captains and the shouting, his own included. Young Halpin was of a dreamy, indolent, and rather romantic turn, somewhat more addicted to literature than law, the profession to which he was bred. Among those of his relations who professed the modern faith of heredity, it was well understood that in him the character of the late Myron Bayne, a maternal great-grandfather, had revisited the glimpses of the moon, by which orb Bayne had in his lifetime been sufficiently affected to be a poet of no small colonial distinction. If not specially observed, it was observable that while a Frayser who was not the proud possessor of a sumptuous copy of the ancestral poetical works, printed at the family expense and long ago withdrawn from an inhospitable market, was a rare Frayser indeed, there was an illogical indisposition to honor the great deceased in the person of his spiritual successor. Halpin was pretty generally deprecated as an intellectual black sheep who was likely at any moment to disgrace the flock by bleating in meter. The Tennessee Fraysers were a practical folk, not practical in the popular sense of devotion to sordid pursuits, but having a robust contempt for any qualities unfitting a man for the wholesome vocation of politics. In justice to young Halpin, it should be said that, while in him were pretty faithfully reproduced most of the mental and moral characteristics ascribed by history and family tradition to the famous colonial bard, his succession to the gift and faculty divine was purely inferential. Not only had he never been known to court the muse, but in truth he could not have written correctly a line of verse to save himself from the killer of the wise. Still, there was no knowing when the dormant faculty might wake and smite the lyre. In the meantime, the young man was rather a loose fish, anyhow. Between him and his mother, was the most perfect sympathy, for secretly the lady was herself a devout disciple of the late and great Myron Bayne, though with the tact so generally and justly admired in her sex, despite the hardy calumniators who insist that it is essentially the same thing as cunning, she had always taken care to conceal her weakness from all eyes but those of him who shared it. Their common guilt in respect of that was an added tie between them. If in Halpin's youth his mother had spoiled him, he had assuredly done his part toward being spoiled. As he grew to such manhood as is attainable by a Southerner who does not care which way elections go, the attachment between him and his beautiful mother, whom from early childhood he had called Katie, became yearly stronger and more tender. In these two romantic natures was manifest in a signal way that neglected phenomenon, the dominance of the sexual element in all the relations of life, strengthening, softening, and beautifying even those of consanguinity. The two were nearly inseparable, and by strangers observing their manner were not infrequently mistaken for lovers. Entering his mother's boudoir one day, Halpin Frayser kissed her upon the forehead, toyed for a moment with a lock of her dark hair which had escaped from its confining pins, and said, with an obvious effort at calmness, "Would you greatly mind, Katie, if I were called away to California for a few weeks?" It was hardly needful for Katie to answer with her lips a question to which her telltale cheeks had made instant reply. Evidently she would greatly mind, and the tears, too, sprang into her large brown eyes as corroborative testimony. "Ah, my son," she said, looking up into his face with infinite tenderness, "I should have known that this was coming. Did I not lie awake a half of the night weeping because during the other half Grandfather Bayne had come to me in a dream, and standing by his portrait, young too and handsome as that, pointed to yours on the same wall? And when I looked, it seemed that I could not see the features. You had been painted with a face-cloth, such as we put upon the dead. Your father has laughed at me, but you and I, dear, know that such things are not for nothing. And I saw below the edge of the cloth the marks of hands on your throat. Forgive me, but we have not been used to keep such things from each other. Perhaps you have another interpretation. Perhaps it does not mean that you will go to California, or maybe you will take me with you." It must be confessed that this ingenious interpretation of the dream in the light of newly discovered evidence did not wholly commend itself to the son's more logical mind. He had, for the moment at least, a conviction that it foreshadowed a more simple and immediate, if less tragic, disaster than a visit to the Pacific coast. It was Halpin Frayser's impression that he was to be garroted on his native heath. "Are there not medicinal springs in California?" Mrs. Frayser resumed, before he had time to give her the true reading of the dream. "Places where one recovers from rheumatism and neuralgia? Look, my fingers feel so stiff, and I am almost sure they have been giving me great pain while I slept." She held out her hands for his inspection. What diagnosis of her case the young man may have thought it best to conceal with a smile, the historian is unable to state. But for himself, he feels bound to say that fingers looking less stiff and showing fewer evidences of even insensible pain have seldom been submitted for medical inspection by even the fairest patient desiring a prescription of unfamiliar scenes. The outcome of it was that of these two odd persons having equally odd notions of duty, the one went to California, as the interest of his client required, and the other remained at home in compliance with a wish that her husband was scarcely conscious of entertaining. While in San Francisco, Halpin Frayser was walking one dark night along the waterfront of the city, when, with a suddenness that surprised and disconcerted him, he became a sailor. He was, in fact, shanghaied aboard a gallant ship, and sailed for a far country. Nor did his misfortunes end with the voyage, for the ship was cast ashore on an island of the South Pacific, and it was 6 years afterward when the survivors were taken off by a venturesome trading schooner and brought back to San Francisco. Though poor in purse, Frayser was no less proud in spirit than he had been in the years that seemed ages and ages ago. He would accept no assistance from strangers, and it was while living with a fellow survivor near the town of St. Helena, awaiting news and remittances from home, that he had gone gunning and dreaming. 3. The apparition confronting the dreamer in the haunted wood, the thing so like yet so unlike his mother, was horrible. It stirred no love nor longing in his heart. It came unattended with pleasant memories of a golden past, inspired no sentiment of any kind. All the finer emotions were swallowed up in fear. He tried to turn and run from before it, but his legs were as lead. He was unable to lift his feet from the ground. His arms hung helpless at his sides. Of his eyes only he retained control, and these he dared not remove from the lustreless orbs of the apparition, which he knew was not a soul without a body, but that most dreadful of all existences infesting that haunted wood, a body without a soul. In its blank stare was neither love nor pity nor intelligence, nothing to which to address an appeal for mercy. An appeal will not lie, he thought, with an absurd reversion to professional slang, making the situation more horrible, as the fire of a cigar might light up a tomb. For a time, which seemed so long that the world grew grey with age and sin, and the haunted forest, having fulfilled its purpose in this monstrous culmination of its terrors, vanished out of his consciousness with all its sights and sounds. The apparition stood within a pace, regarding him with the mindless malevolence of a wild brute, then thrust its hands forward and sprang upon him with appalling ferocity. The act released his physical energies without unfettering his will. His mind was still spellbound, but his powerful body and agile limbs, endowed with a blind, insensate life of their own, resisted stoutly and well. For an instant he seemed to see this unnatural contest between a dead intelligence and a breathing mechanism only as a spectator. Such fancies are in dreams. Then he regained his identity almost as if by a leap forward into his body, and the straining automaton had a directing will as alert and fierce as that of its hideous antagonist. But what mortal can cope with a creature of his dream? The imagination creating the enemy is already vanquished. The combat's result is the combat's cause. Despite his struggles, despite his strength and activity, which seemed wasted in a void, he felt the cold fingers close upon his throat. Borne backward to the earth, he saw above him the dead and drawn face within a hand's breadth of his own, and then all was black. A sound as of the beating of distant drums, a murmur of swarming voices, a sharp, far cry signing all to silence, and Halpin Frayser dreamed that he was dead. 4. A warm, clear night had been followed by a morning of drenching fog. At about the middle of the afternoon of the preceding day, a little whiff of light vapor, a mere thickening of the atmosphere, the ghost of a cloud, had been observed clinging to the western side of Mount St. Helena, away up along the barren altitudes near the summit. It was so thin, so diaphanous, so like a fancy made visible, that one would have said, "Look quickly, in a moment it will be gone." In a moment it was visibly larger and denser. While with one edge it clung to the mountain, with the other it reached farther and farther out into the air above the lower slopes. At the same time it extended itself to north and south, joining small patches of mist that appeared to come out of the mountainside on exactly the same level, with an intelligent design to be absorbed. And so it grew and grew until the summit was shut out of view from the valley, and over the valley itself was an ever-extending canopy, opaque and grey. At Calistoga, which lies near the head of the valley and the foot of the mountain, there were a starless night and a sunless morning. The fog, sinking into the valley, had reached southward, swallowing up ranch after ranch, until it had blotted out the town of St. Helena, 9 miles away. The dust in the road was laid, trees were adrip with moisture, birds sat silent in their coverts, the morning light was wan and ghastly, with neither colour nor fire. 2 men left the town of St. Helena at the first glimmer of dawn, and walked along the road northward up the valley toward Calistoga. They carried guns on their shoulders, yet no one having knowledge of such matters could have mistaken them for hunters of bird or beast. They were a deputy sheriff from Napa and a detective from San Francisco, Holker and Jarrelson respectively. Their business was man-hunting. "How far is it?" inquired Holker as they strode along, their feet stirring white the dust beneath the damp surface of the road. "The White Church? Only a half-mile farther," the other answered. "By the way," he added, "it is neither white nor a church. It is an abandoned schoolhouse, grey with age and neglect. Religious services were once held in it, when it was white, and there is a graveyard that would delight a poet. Can you guess why I sent for you and told you to come healed? Oh, I never have bothered you about things of that kind. I've always found you communicative when the time came. But if I may hazard a guess, you want me to help you arrest one of the corpses in the graveyard. You remember Branscombe? Said Jarlson, treating his companion's wit with the inattention that it deserved. The chap who cut his wife's throat? I ought. I wasted a week's work on him, and had my expenses for my trouble. There is a reward of $500, but none of us ever got a sight of him. You don't mean to say— Yes, I do. He has been under the noses of you fellows all the time. He comes by night to the old graveyard at the White Church. The devil! That's where they buried his wife. Well, you fellows might have had sense enough to suspect that he would return to her grave sometime. The very last place that anyone would have expected him to return to. But you had exhausted all the other places. Learning your failure at them, I laid for him there. And you found him? Damn it, he found me. The rascal got the drop on me. Regularly held me up and made me travel. It's God's mercy that he didn't go through me. Oh, he's a good one, and I fancy the half of that reward is enough for me if you're needy. Holker laughed good-humouredly, and explained that his creditors were never more importunate. I wanted merely to show you the ground and arrange a plan with you, the detective explained. I thought it as well for us to be healed, even in daylight. The man must be insane, said the deputy sheriff. The reward is for his capture and conviction. If he's mad, he won't be convicted. Mr. Holker was so profoundly affected by that possible failure of justice that he involuntarily stopped in the middle of the road and resumed his walk with abated zeal. Well, he looks it, assented Jarlson. I'm bound to admit that a more unshaven, unshorn, unkempt, and uneverything wretch I never saw outside the ancient and honourable order of tramps. But I've gone in for him, and can't make up my mind to let go. There's glory in it for us, anyhow. Not another soul knows that he is this side of the mountains of the moon. All right, Holker said. We will go and view the ground. And he added, in the words of a once favourite inscription for tombstones, where you must shortly lie. I mean, if old Branscombe ever gets tired of you and your impertinent intrusion. By the way, I heard the other day that Branscombe was not his real name. What is? I can't recall it. I had lost all interest in the wretch, and it did not fix itself in my memory. Something like Pardee. The woman whose throat he had the bad taste to cut was a widow when he met her. She had come to California to look up some relatives. There are persons who will do that sometimes. But you know all that. Naturally. But not knowing the right name, by what happy inspiration did you find the right grave? The man who told me what the name was said it had been cut on the headboard. I don't know the right grave. Jarlson was apparently a trifle reluctant to admit his ignorance of so important a point of his plan. I've been watching about the place generally. A part of our work this morning will be to identify that grave. Here is the White Church. For a long distance the road had been bordered by fields on both sides, but now on the left there was a forest of oaks, madroneos, and gigantic spruces whose lower parts only could be seen, dim and ghostly in the fog. The undergrowth was, in places, thick, but nowhere impenetrable. For some moments Holker saw nothing of the building, but as they turned into the woods it revealed itself in faint grey outline through the fog, looking huge and far away. A few steps more, and it was within an arm's length, distinct, dark with moisture, and insignificant in size. It had the usual country schoolhouse form, belonged to the packing-box order of architecture, had an underpinning of stones, a moss-grown roof, and blank window spaces, whence both glass and sash had long departed. It was ruined, but not a ruin, a typical Californian substitute for what are known to guide-bookers abroad as monuments of the past. With scarcely a glance at this uninteresting structure, Jarlson moved on into the dripping undergrowth beyond. I will show you where he held me up, he said. This is the graveyard. Here and there among the bushes were small enclosures containing graves, sometimes no more than one. They were recognized as graves by the discoloured stones or rotting boards at head and foot, leaning at all angles, some prostrate, by the ruined picket fences surrounding them, or infrequently by the mound itself showing its gravel through the fallen leaves. In many instances, Nothing marked the spot where lay the vestiges of some poor mortal, who, leaving a large circle of sorrowing friends, had been left by them in turn, except a depression in the earth, more lasting than that in the spirits of the mourners. The paths, if any paths had been, were long obliterated. Trees of a considerable size had been permitted to grow up from the graves and thrust aside with root or branch the enclosing fences. Over all was that air of abandonment and decay which seems nowhere so fit and significant as in a village of the forgotten dead. As the two men, Jarlson leading, pushed their way through the growth of young trees, that enterprising man suddenly stopped and brought up his shotgun to the height of his breast, uttered a low note of warning, and stood motionless, his eyes fixed upon something ahead. As well as he could, obstructed by brush, his companion, though seeing nothing, imitated the posture and so stood, prepared for what might ensue. A moment later, Jarlson moved cautiously forward, the other following. Under the branches of an enormous spruce lay the dead body of a man. Standing silent above it, they noted such particulars as first strike the attention. The face, the attitude, the clothing, whatever most promptly and plainly answers the unspoken question of a sympathetic curiosity. The body lay upon its back, the legs wide apart. One arm was thrust upward, the other outward, but the latter was bent acutely, and the hand was near the throat. Both hands were tightly clenched. The whole attitude was that of desperate but ineffectual resistance to what? Nearby lay a shotgun, and a game bag through the meshes of which was seen the plumage of shot birds. All about were evidences of a furious struggle. Small sprouts of poison oak were bent and denuded of leaf and bark. Dead and rotting leaves had been pushed into heaps and ridges on both sides of the legs by the action of other feet than theirs. Alongside their hips were unmistakable impressions of human knees. The nature of the struggle was made clear by a glance at the dead man's throat and face. While breast and hands were white, those were purple, almost black. The shoulders lay upon a low mound, and the head was turned back at an angle otherwise impossible, the expanded eyes staring blankly backward in a direction opposite to that of the feet. From the froth filling the open mouth, the tongue protruded, black and swollen. The throat showed horrible contusions, not mere finger marks, but bruises and lacerations wrought by two strong hands that must have buried themselves in the yielding flesh, maintaining their terrible grasp until long after death. Breast, throat, face were wet. The clothing was saturated. Drops of water, condensed from the fog, studded the hair and moustache. All this the two men observed without speaking, almost at a glance. Then Holker said, "Poor devil, he had a rough deal." Jarlson was making a vigilant circumspection of the forest, his shotgun held in both hands and at full cock, his finger upon the trigger. "The work of a maniac," he said, without withdrawing his eyes from the enclosing wood. "It was done by Branscombe. Pardy." Something half hidden by the disturbed leaves on the earth caught Holker's attention. It was a red leather pocket-book. He picked it up and opened it. It contained leaves of white paper for memoranda, and upon the first leaf was the name Halpin Frayser. Written in red on several succeeding leaves, scrawled as if in haste and barely legible, were the following lines, which Holker read aloud, while his companion continued scanning the dim grey confines of their narrow world and hearing matter of apprehension in the drip of water from every burdened branch. Enthralled by some mysterious spell, I stood in the lit gloom of an enchanted wood. The cypress there and myrtle twined their boughs, significant in baleful brotherhood. The brooding willow whispered to the yew beneath the deadly nightshade and the rue. With immortals self-woven into strange funeral shapes and horrid nettles grew. No song or bird, nor any drone of bees, nor light leaf lifted by the wholesome breeze. The air was stagnant all, and silence was a living thing that breathed among the trees. Conspiring spirits whispered in the gloom, half heard the stilly secrets of the tomb. With blood the trees were all adrip, the leaves shone in the witchlight with a ruddy bloom. I cried aloud. The spell unbroken still rested upon my spirit and my will. Unsouled, unhearted, hopeless and forlorn, I strove with monstrous presages of ill. At last, the viewless... Holker ceased reading. There was no more to read. The manuscript broke off in the middle of a line. "That sounds like Bane," said Jaralson, who was something of a scholar in his way. He had abated his vigilance and stood looking down at the body. "Who's Bane?" Holker asked, rather incuriously. "Myron Bane, a chap who flourished in the early years of the nation, more than a century ago. Wrote mighty dismal stuff. I have his collected works. That poem is not among them, but it must have been omitted by mistake." "It is cold," said Holker. "Let us leave here. We must have up the coroner from Napa." Jaralson said nothing, but made a movement in compliance. Passing the end of the slight elevation of earth upon which the dead man's head and shoulders lay, his foot struck some hard substance under the rotting forest leaves, and he took the trouble to kick it into view. It was a fallen headboard, and painted on it were the hardly decipherable words, "Catherine Leroux." "Leroux! Leroux!" exclaimed Holker, with sudden animation. "Why, that is the real name of Branscombe, not Pardee, and, bless my soul, how it all comes to me. The murdered woman's name had been Frayser." "There is some rascally mystery here," said Detective Jaralson. "I hate anything of that kind." There came to them out of the fog, seemingly from a great distance, the sound of a laugh, a low, deliberate, soulless laugh, which had no more of joy than that of a hyena night-prowling in the desert, a laugh that rose by slow gradation, louder and louder, clearer, more distinct and terrible, until it seemed barely outside the narrow circle of their vision, a laugh so unnatural, so unhuman, so devilish, that it filled those hardy manhunters with a sense of dread unspeakable. They did not move their weapons, nor think of them. The menace of that horrible sound was not of the kind to be met with arms. As it had grown out of silence, so now it died away. From a culminating shout which had seemed almost in their ears, it drew itself away into the distance, until its failing notes, joyless and mechanical to the last, sank to silence at a measureless remove. The Hunt by Jennifer Gill. It was an unseasonably cold, crisp autumn morning. Mist was rising on the fields as she drove through the expansive North Yorkshire countryside. A multitude of emotions ran through the mind of Rebecca Coleman: anticipation, exhilaration, confliction. Pulling up at the stables, she stepped out of her car. The sound of baying dogs reverberated throughout the large courtyard. The excitement in the air was electrifying. This was Rebecca's first hunt. At 23, with 10 years of experience, she was an accomplished rider who had joined the club 4 months earlier, but hadn't yet been out in the field. Beechwood Stables was on the west side of the town of Garswell, a quaint Georgian market town steeped in history and charm. On the east side was the dense 50,000-acre Elderwood Forest, forming part of the centuries-old Elderwood Estate. The tradition of hunting was strong. Fox, deer, and game bird hunting had taken place annually on the Elderwood Estate for over 500 years. These days, though, drag hunting was the principal sport, the act of following the trail of an artificial scent along predetermined routes. Despite the club no longer hunting live animals, the atmosphere was still adrenaline-charged. Men and women rushed around in traditional riding gear, preparing the horses and directing the dogs. Rebecca was eager, but nervous. Tucking her hair into a hairnet, she opened the stable gate, where Chester, her dappled grey Dutch warmblood, was housed. He whinnied and brushed his handsome head against her. She could tell he was keen to get going. It was his first time, too. Taking a container of apple slices from her bag, Rebecca emptied them into the new bucket she had brought with her. She grabbed a grooming brush and, while he was quiet, enjoying his treat, brushed and plaited his mane. Plaiting wasn't necessary during this season, but grooming helped calm the novice's nerves, and Chester loved the attention. Checking her watch, she saw that it was almost time to join the hunting party. She lifted on Chester's saddle, fastened the girth, and adjusted the flaps. Then it was her turn to get ready. Formal customs were still strong at the Elderwood Club. Traditional roles were filled: master, junior master, secretary, treasurer, huntsman, and so on. But as the hunting of live animals had been outlawed, social rituals such as blooding had long since been abandoned. One tradition that had relaxed over the past half-century was the hunt attire, which had become more informal. Members now hunted in rat-catcher-style tweed jackets and tan jodhpurs, rather than full formal dress, all with the exception of the higher-ranking members, who wore red coats. Exploiting this more informal style, Rebecca fixed her stock tie to her shirt and secured it with the stunning gold stock pin her grandmother had given her for her 18th birthday, an item she hadn't had occasion to wear until now. Pulling on her tweed jacket and grabbing the black suede helmet that had been hanging beside the stable door, she paused and took a deep breath. Chester neighed his approval. The hunting party was gathering as the first-timer led her strong stallion out into the courtyard of Beechwood Stables. His excitement and confidence reassured her, and the buzz of the riders gave her goosebumps. Joining the back of the group, Rebecca shared pleasantries with a handful of familiar faces and exchanged formal greetings with new acquaintances. Then, putting her foot in the stirrup, she stroked the soft coat on Chester's long neck and pulled herself up onto him. At the front of the group, the 20-strong pack of English pointers waited patiently, tails and tongues wagging, filled with excitement. The huntsman blew his horn, and the dogs became instantly still and silent. They were ready to begin. Starting the journey through the village, the huntsman took the lead, and the gun dogs obediently followed, with the remainder of the riders falling into line behind. Rebecca's heart was racing. Her thoughts were conflicted. She had never been sure, didn't know if she really wanted to participate in the hunt. But the adrenaline coursing through her veins told a different story. Passers-by stopped to watch and cheer on the hunters as they trotted through the village, celebrating this long-lasting tradition, the redcoats of the hunt staff and master standing out against the bright blue Yorkshire sky. For the young rider, whose preceding nervousness had now been replaced entirely by exhilaration, the short journey from the west side of Garswold to the edge of the expansive estate felt like an eternity. As the hunting party made their way to the start of the pre-designated drag route, Rebecca took in the beauty of the acreage, the stunning manor house, the wildflower meadows, the forests and the rolling hills of established farmland. Tensions rose as the group began to gather at the entrance to Elderwood Forest. The dogs had again begun to bay impatiently. Falling into line at the back of the hunting party, Rebecca turned Chester to allow the master to pass, and noticed the huntsman trotting towards her. It was tradition, he told her, for a newcomer to join the huntsman on the first trail of the season. Rebecca was confused. This was not what she had been told, and certainly not what she had expected. Her father had hunted, and his father before him, a family tradition she had been keen to follow. However, she had hoped she could hang back, get a feel for what was going on. But now, the huntsman was personally asking her to participate. Why? Time was running out. She couldn't refuse. Etiquette dictated politeness. His eyes burned into hers, awaiting her response. Yes, she said. She would love to. Now the adrenaline was really pumping. Perspiration was beginning to form on her forehead. Her hands were shaking. As the field master led the rest of the riders away, Rebecca sensed the dog's growing excitement, could feel Chester's anticipation beneath her. The huntsman blew the horn to calm the dogs, and told Rebecca they were about to begin. Pushing aside all the negative thoughts she'd had, she took a deep breath, and, as the sound of the horn filled the air, followed the huntsman into the fray. The sound of the well-trained pointers echoed around the estate. It was deafening and unsettling. The dogs picked up the scent. The two riders followed. Galloping through the forest, Rebecca consumed the environment, the smell of pine, the sun's rays streaming through the canopy, and the wind whirling past her face, gently stroking her cheeks. She was at one with the forest. Unexpectedly, something caught her eye ahead, and she pulled Chester's reins to slow him down. Squinting, she scanned for signs of movement, then looked over at the huntsman. He was focused, determined, and suddenly she realized they were hunting a live target. Thoughts flashed through her mind. This is wrong, cruel, inhumane, illegal. But her excitement was unprecedented. The huntsman glanced at her with an aberrant look in his eyes. Slowing down and trotting towards her, he reached down by the side of his thoroughbred saddle. All this time, Rebecca hadn't noticed the scabbard hanging by the huntsman's right leg. Slowly, never taking his eyes off her, he pulled out the rifle and handed it to her. She took it instantly. She didn't dare not to. The seasoned hunter then reached down his left side and pulled out another. Adrenaline surged through her. What the hell was he doing with 2 guns, let alone 1? This was supposed to be a drag hunt, not a live hunt. Looking around, she realized they were deep within the heart of Elderwood Forest, the density of the trees darkening the bright autumn day. And, apart from the horses, 3 remaining dogs, and whatever it was they were now hunting, they were alone. Giving the huntsman a nod, indicating that she would continue, she slung the rifle over her shoulder, and they slowly continued their journey through the woodland, the dogs pursuing the target. Without warning, one of the dogs broke away from the pack, and the huntsman instructed her to follow it. She obeyed. After several minutes, the dog stopped, having lost the scent of the quarry it had been chasing. Rebecca pulled Chester to a stop as the pointer's head turned from side to side, its nose in the air, searching. The moment seemed to last for hours. Time slowed down as the 3 of them surveyed the area. A twig snapped behind them, and their heads turned as one. There was nothing there, no sign of the target. The young woman, who had believed she was joining the huntsman on the first trail hunt of the season, was now poised, senses awakened, checking for signs of movement. The dog howled. The scent was found. They were on the move again. As the dog pushed on ahead of them, Rebecca nudged Chester with her heel to coax him on, the gun swinging on her back as they galloped through the trees. The excitement built to a level she had never felt before. Leaping over a fallen limb, she momentarily lost sight of the dog. Panicking, she pulled Chester to a stop and looked around. With no sign of the dog or the dog's target, aside from her loyal companion, she was alone. A deep silence had descended over Elderwood Forest. The gun dog's sudden barking startled both girl and stallion, and Rebecca could practically hear her pulse throbbing in her head. Slowly, the pair turned and approached the area where the barking had originated. Staying true to its breed, the dog was frozen, nose pointing towards a seemingly impenetrable patch of hawthorn, exposing its target. Stepping down from her horse, Rebecca was filled with apprehension. Pulling her newly acquired gun around, she slowly approached the bright red berry-laden bush. Then she saw it. Him. Crouched beneath a large woodland shrub, his ostensibly safe hiding place revealed by the gun dog, was a man, emaciated, disheveled, and not much older than herself. "Oh, God, please no," he implored in a broken voice, as his terrified eyes looked up at her, then at the dog, and then quickly back to the ground. Mechanically, Rebecca lifted, aimed, and cocked her firearm. "Please," he continued, "don't do this." Tears streaked the man's dirt-covered face as he pleaded for his life, scuffling away from Rebecca's aim, only to be trapped by more hawthorn. "Please," he beseeched again, "I have a family. I have a child." Hesitating, doubts began to surface. She had only wanted to observe the first trail hunt of the season, but instead had been dragged right into the middle of a live hunt by the huntsman himself. The man was right. This was wrong. Holding her aim, she looked to the dog, who remained fastidiously pointed towards the man, then to Chester behind her, who stood firm and proud, head held high. "I didn't mean to. It was an accident," the man whispered through sobs. Sighing, Rebecca relaxed her frame. She looked back to the man cowering in the bush. She was trembling. A bead of sweat trickled down the center of her neck. Her trigger finger was shaking. Her heart was racing. The dog was still, nose pointed at the target. She could hear the pack of gun dogs barking and howling in the distance. The huntsman must have caught up with them. The thunder of hooves came towards them. The rest of the hunt. It was now or never. She had a choice to make. To set this man free, or... A single shot rang out. Genius Loci by Clark Ashton Smith. "It is a very strange place," said Amberville, "but I scarcely know how to convey the impression it made upon me. It will all sound so simple and ordinary. There is nothing but a sedgy meadow, surrounded on three sides by slopes of yellow pine. A dreary little stream flows in from the open end, to lose itself in a cul-de-sac of cattails and boggy ground. The stream, running slowly and more slowly, forms a stagnant pool of some extent, from which several sickly-looking alders seem to fling themselves backward, as if unwilling to approach it. A dead willow leans above the pool, tangling its wan, skeleton-like reflection with the green scum that mottles the water. There are no blackbirds, no kildees, no dragonflies even, such as one usually finds in a place of that sort. It is all silent and desolate. The spot is evil. It is unholy in a way that I simply can't describe. I was compelled to make a drawing of it, almost against my will, since anything so outre is hardly in my line. In fact, I made 2 drawings. I'll show them to you if you like. Since I had a high opinion of Amberville's artistic abilities, and had long considered him one of the foremost landscape painters of his generation, I was naturally eager to see the drawings. He, however, did not even pause to await my avowal of interest, but began at once to open his portfolio. His facial expression, the very movements of his hands, were somehow eloquent of a strange mixture of compulsion and repugnance as he brought out and displayed the 2 watercolor sketches he had mentioned. I could not recognize the scene depicted from either of them. Plainly, it was one that I had missed in my desultory rambling about the foothill environs of the tiny hamlet of Bowman, where, 2 years before, I had purchased an uncultivated ranch and had retired for the privacy so essential to prolonged literary effort. Francis Amberville, in the 1 fortnight of his visit, through his flair for the pictorial potentialities of landscape, had doubtless grown more familiar with the neighborhood than I. It had been his habit to roam about in the forenoon, armed with sketching materials, and in this way he had already found the theme of more than one lovely painting. The arrangement was mutually convenient, since I, in his absence, was wont to apply myself assiduously to an antique Remington typewriter. I examined the drawings attentively. Both, though of hurried execution, were highly meritorious, and showed the characteristic grace and vigor of Amberville's style. And yet, even at first glance, I found a quality that was more alien to the spirit of his work. The elements of the scene were those he had described. In one picture, the pool was half hidden by a fringe of mace reeds, and the dead willow was leaning across it at a prone, despondent angle, as if mysteriously arrested in its fall toward the stagnant waters. Beyond, the alders seemed to strain away from the pool, exposing their knotted roots as if in eternal effort. In the other drawing, the pool formed the main portion of the foreground, with a skeleton tree looming drearily at one side. At the water's farther end, the cattails seemed to wave and whisper among themselves in a dying wind, and the steeply barring slope of pine at the meadow's terminus was indicated as a wall of gloomy green that closed in the picture, leaving only a pale margin of autumnal sky at the top. All this, as the painter had said, was ordinary enough, but I was impressed immediately by a profound horror that lurked in these simple elements, and was expressed by them as if by the balefully contorted features of some demoniac face. In both drawings this sinister character was equally evident, as if the same face had been shown in profile and front view. I could not trace the separate details that composed the impressions, but ever, as I looked, the abomination of a strange evil, a spirit of despair, malignity, desolation, leered from the drawing more openly and hatefully. The spot seemed to wear a macabre and satanic grimace. One felt that it might speak aloud, might utter the imprecations of some gigantic devil, or the raucous derision of 1,000 birds of ill omen. The evil conveyed was something wholly outside of humanity, more ancient than man. Somehow, fantastic as this will seem, the meadow had the air of a vampire, grown old and hideous with unutterable infamies. Subtly, indefinably, it thirsted for other things than the sluggish trickle of water by which it was fed. "Where is the place?" I asked after a minute or two of silent inspection. It was incredible that anything of the sort could really exist, and equally incredible that a nature so robust as Amberville should have been sensitive to its quality. "It's in the bottom of that abandoned ranch, a mile or less down the little road toward Bear River," he replied. "You must know it. There's a small orchard about the house, on the upper hillside, but the lower portion, ending in that meadow, is all wild land." I began to visualize the vicinity in question. "Guess it must be the old Chapman place," I decided. "No other ranch along that road would answer your specifications." "Well, whoever it belongs to, that meadow is the most horrible spot I've ever encountered. I've known other landscapes that had something wrong with them, but never anything like this." "Maybe it's haunted," I said, half in jest. "From your description, it must be the very meadow where old Chapman was found dead one morning by his youngest daughter. It happened a few months after I moved here. He was supposed to have died of heart failure. His body was quite cold, and he had probably been lying there all night, since the family had missed him at supper time. I don't remember him very clearly, but I remember that he had a reputation for eccentricity. For some time before his death, people thought he was going mad. I forget the details. Anyway, his wife and children left, not long after he died, and no one has occupied the house or cultivated the orchard since. It was a commonplace rural tragedy." "I'm not much of a believer in spooks," observed Amberville, who seemed to have taken my suggestion of haunting in a literal sense. "Whatever the influence is, it's hardly of human origin. Come to think of it, though, I received a very silly impression once or twice. The idea that someone was watching me while I did those drawings. Queer. I had almost forgotten that, till you brought up the possibility of haunting. I seemed to see him out of the tail of my eye, just beyond the radius that I was putting into the picture. A dilapidated old scoundrel with dirty grey whiskers and an evil scowl. It's odd, too, that I should have gotten such a definite conception of him without ever seeing him squarely. I thought it was a tramp who had strayed into the meadow bottom. But when I turned to give him a level glance, he simply wasn't there. It was as if he melted into the miry ground, the cattails, the sedges." "That isn't a bad description of Chapman," I said. "I remember his whiskers. They were almost white except for the tobacco juice. A battered antique, if there ever was one, and very unamiable, too. He had a poisonous glare toward the end, which no doubt helped along the legend of his insanity. Some of the tales about him come back to me now. People said that he neglected the care of his orchard more and more. Visitors used to find him in that lower meadow, standing idly about and staring vacantly at the trees and water. Probably that was one reason they thought he was losing his mind, but I'm sure I never heard that there was anything unusual or queer about the meadow, either at the time of Chapman's death or since. It's a lonely spot, and I don't imagine that anyone ever goes there now." "I stumbled on it quite by accident," said Amberville. "The place isn't visible from the road on account of the thick pines. But there's another odd thing. I went out this morning with a very strong and clear intuition that I might find something of uncommon interest. I made a beeline for that meadow, so to speak. and I'll have to admit that the intuition justified itself. The place repels me, but it fascinates me too. I've simply got to solve the mystery, if it has a solution," he added with a slightly defensive air. "I'm going back early tomorrow with my oils, to start a real painting of it." I was surprised, knowing that predilection of Amberville for scenic brilliance and gaiety which had caused him to be likened to Sir Roy. "The painting will be a novelty for you," I commented. "I'll have to come and take a look at the place myself before long. It should really be more in my line than yours. There ought to be a weird story in it somewhere if it lives up to your drawings and description." Several days passed. I was deeply preoccupied at the time with the toilsome and intricate problems offered by the concluding chapters of a new novel, and I put off my proposed visit to the meadow discovered by Amberville. My friend, on his part, was evidently engrossed by his new theme. He sallied forth each morning with his easel and oil colours, and returned later each day, forgetful of the luncheon hour that had formerly brought him back from such expeditions. On the third day he did not reappear till sunset. Contrary to his custom, he did not show me what he had done, and his answers to my queries regarding the progress of the picture were somewhat vague and evasive. For some reason he was unwilling to talk about it. Also, he was apparently loath to discuss the meadow itself, and in answer to direct questions, merely reiterated in an absent and perfunctory manner the account he had given me following his discovery of the place. In some mysterious way that I could not define, his attitude seemed to have changed. There were other changes, too. He seemed to have lost his usual blitheness. Often I caught him frowning intently, and surprised the lurking of some equivocal shadow in his frank eyes. There was a moodiness, a morbidity which, as far as our 5 years' friendship enabled me to observe, was a new aspect of his temperament. Perhaps, if I had not been so preoccupied with my own difficulties, I might have wondered more as to the causation of his gloom, which I attributed readily enough at first to some technical dilemma that was baffling him. He was less and less the Amberville that I knew, and on the fourth day, when he came back at twilight, I perceived an actual surliness that was quite foreign to his nature. "What's wrong?" I ventured to inquire. "Have you struck a snag? Or is old Chapman's meadow getting on your nerves with its ghostly influences?" He seemed, for once, to make an effort to throw off his gloom, his taciturnity and ill humour. "It's the infernal mystery of the thing," he declared. "I've simply got to solve it, in one way or another. The place has an entity of its own, an indwelling personality. It's there, like the soul in a human body, but I can't pin it down or touch it. You know that I'm not superstitious. But on the other hand, I'm not a bigoted materialist either, and I've run across some odd phenomena in my time. That meadow, perhaps, is inhabited by what the ancients called a genius loci. More than once, before this, I have suspected that such things might exist, might reside inherent in some particular spot. But this is the first time that I've had reason to suspect anything of an actively malignant or inimical nature. The other influences whose presence I have felt were benign in some large, vague, impersonal way, or were else wholly indifferent to human welfare, perhaps oblivious of human existence. This thing, however, is hatefully aware and watchful. I feel that the meadow itself, or the force embodied in the meadow, is scrutinizing me all the time. The place has the air of a thirsty vampire, waiting to drink me in somehow if it can. It is a cul-de-sac of everything evil, in which an unwary soul might well be caught and absorbed. But I tell you, Murray, I can't keep away from it." "It looks as if the place were getting you," I said, thoroughly astonished by his extraordinary declaration, and by the air of fearful and morbid conviction with which he uttered it. Apparently he had not heard me, for he made no reply to my observation. "There's another angle," he went on, with a feverish tensity in his voice. "You remember my impression of an old man lurking in the background and watching me on my first visit? Well, I have seen him again, many times, out of the corner of my eye, and during the last 2 days he has appeared more directly, though in a queer, partial way. Sometimes, when I am studying the dead willow very intently, I see his scowling, filthy, bearded face as a part of the bowl. Then, again, it will float among the leafless twigs, as if it had been caught there. Sometimes a knotty hand, a tattered coat sleeve will emerge through the mantling algae in the pool, as if a drowned body were rising to the surface. Then, a moment later, or simultaneously, there will be something of him among the alders or the cattails. These apparitions are always brief, and when I try to scrutinize them closely, they melt like films of vapor into the surrounding scene. For the old scoundrel, whoever or whatever he may be, is a sort of fixture. He is no less vile than everything else about the place, though I feel that he isn't the main element of the vileness. "Good Lord," I exclaimed. "You certainly have been seeing things. If you don't mind, I'll come down and join you for a while tomorrow afternoon. The mystery begins to inveigle me." "Of course I don't mind. Come ahead." His manner, all at once, for no tangible reason, had resumed the unnatural taciturnity of the past 4 days. He gave me a furtive look that was sullen and almost unfriendly. It was as if an obscure barrier, temporarily laid aside, had again risen between us. The shadows of his strange mood returned upon him visibly, and my efforts to continue the conversation were rewarded only by half-surly, half-absent monosyllables. Feeling an aroused concern, rather than any offense, I began to note, for the first time, the unwonted pallor of his face, and the bright, febrile luster of his eyes. He looked vaguely unwell, I thought, as if something of his exuberant vitality had gone out of him, and had left in its place an alien energy of doubtful and less healthy nature. Tacitly, I gave up any attempt to bring him back from the secretive twilight into which he had withdrawn. For the rest of the evening, I pretended to read a novel, while Amberville maintained his singular abstraction. Somewhat inconclusively, I puzzled over the matter till bedtime. I made up my mind, however, that I would visit Chapman's Meadow. I did not believe in the supernatural, but it seemed apparent that the place was exerting a deleterious influence upon Amberville. The next morning, when I arose, my Chinese servant informed me that the painter had already breakfasted and had gone out with his easel and colours. This further proof of his obsession troubled me, but I applied myself rigorously to a forenoon of writing. Immediately after luncheon, I drove down the highway, followed the narrow dirt road that branched off toward Bear River, and left my car on the pine-thick hill above the old Chapman place. Though I had never visited the meadow, I had a pretty clear idea of its location. Disregarding the grassy, half-obliterated road into the upper portion of the property, I struck down through the woods into the little blind valley, seeing more than once, on the opposite slope, the dying orchard of pear and apple trees, and the tumble-down shanty that had belonged to the Chapmans. It was a warm October day, and the serene solitude of the forest, the autumnal softness of light and air, made the idea of anything malign or sinister seem impossible. When I came to the meadow bottom, I was ready to laugh at Amberville's notions, and the place itself, at first sight, merely impressed me as being rather dreary and dismal. The features of the scene were those that he had described so clearly, but I could not find the open evil that had leered from the pool, the willow, the alders, and the cattails in his drawings. Amberville, with his back toward me, was seated on a folding stool before his easel, which he had placed among the plots of dark green wire grass in the open ground above the pool. He did not seem to be working, however, but was staring intently at the scene beyond him, while a loaded brush drooped idly in his fingers. The sedges deadened my footfalls, and he did not hear me as I drew near. With much curiosity, I peered over his shoulder at the large canvas on which he had been engaged. As far as I could tell, the picture had already been carried to a consummate degree of technical perfection. It was an almost photographic rendering of the scummy water, the whitish skeleton of the leaning willow, the unhealthy, half-disrooted alders, and the cluster of nodding mace-reeds. But in it I found the macabre and demoniac spirit of the sketches. The meadow seemed to wait and watch like an evilly distorted face. It was a deadfall of malignity and despair, lying apart from the autumn world around it, a plague spot of nature, forever accursed and alone. Again I looked at the landscape itself, and saw that the spot was indeed as Amberville had depicted it. It wore the grimace of a mad vampire, hateful and alert. At the same time, I became disagreeably conscious of the unnatural silence. There were no birds, no insects, as the painter had said, and it seemed that only spent and dying winds could ever enter the depressed valley bottom. The thin stream that lost itself in the boggy ground was like a soul that went down to perdition. It was part of the mystery, too, for I could not remember any stream on the lower side of the barring hill that would indicate a subterranean outlet. Amberville's intentness, and the very posture of his head and shoulders, were like those of a man who has been mesmerized. I was about to make my presence known to him, but at that instant there came to me the apperception that we were not alone in the meadow. Just beyond the focus of my vision, a figure seemed to stand in a furtive attitude, as if watching us both. I whirled about, and there was no one. Then I heard a startled cry from Amberville, and turned to find him staring at me. His features wore a wild look of terror and surprise, which had not wholly erased a hypnotic absorption. "My God," he said, "I thought you were the old man." I cannot be sure whether anything more was said by either of us. I have, however, the impression of a blank silence. After his single exclamation of surprise, Amberville seemed to retreat into an impenetrable abstraction, as if he were no longer conscious of my presence, as if, having identified me, he had forgotten me at once. On my part, I felt a weird and overpowering constraint. That infamous, eerie scene depressed me beyond measure. It seemed that the boggy bottom was trying to drag me down in some intangible way. The boughs of the sick alders beckoned. The pool, over which the bony willow presided like an arboreal death, was wooing me foully with its stagnant waters. Moreover, apart from the ominous atmosphere of the scene itself, I was painfully aware of a further change in Amberville, a change that was an actual alienation. His recent mood, whatever it was, had strengthened upon him enormously. He had gone deeper into its morbid twilight, and was lost to the blithe and sanguine personality I had known. It was as if an incipient madness had seized him, and the possibility of this terrified me. In a slow, somnambulistic manner, without giving me a second glance, he began to work at his painting, and I watched him for a while, hardly knowing what to do or say. For long intervals he would stop and peer with dreamy intentness at some feature of the landscape. I conceived the bizarre idea of a growing kinship, a mysterious rapport between Amberville and the meadow. In some intangible way it seemed as if the place had taken something from his very soul, and had given something of itself in exchange. He wore the air of one who participates in some unholy secret, who has become the acolyte of an unhuman knowledge. In a flash of horrible definitude, I saw the place as an actual vampire, and Amberville as its willing victim. How long I remained there, I cannot say. Finally, I stepped over to him and shook him roughly by the shoulder. "You're working too hard," I said. "Take my advice and lay off for a day or two." He turned to me with the dazed look of one who is lost in some narcotic dream. This very slowly gave place to a sullen, evil anger. "Oh, go to hell," he snarled. "Can't you see that I'm busy?" I left him then, for there seemed nothing else to do under the circumstances. The mad and spectral nature of the whole affair was enough to make me doubt my own reason. My impressions of the meadow and of Amberville were tainted with an insidious horror such as I had never before felt in any moment of waking life and normal consciousness. At the bottom of the slope of yellow pine, I turned back with repugnant curiosity for a parting glance. The painter had not moved. He was still confronting the malignant scene like a charmed bird that faces a lethal serpent. Whether or not the impression was a double optic image, I have never been sure, but at that instant I seemed to discern a faint, unholy aura, neither light nor mist, that flowed and wavered about the meadow, preserving the outlines of the willow, the alders, the reeds, the pool. Stealthily it appeared to lengthen, reaching toward Amberville like ghostly arms. The whole image was extremely tenuous, and may well have been an illusion, but it sent me shuddering into the shelter of the tall, benignant pines. The remainder of that day and the evening that followed were tinged with the shadowy horror I had found in Chapman's meadow. I believe that I spent most of the time in arguing vainly with myself, in trying to convince the rational part of my mind that all I had seen and felt was utterly preposterous. I could arrive at no conclusion, other than a conviction that Amberville's mental health was endangered by the damnable thing, whatever it was, that inhered in the meadow. The malign personality of the place, the impalpable terror, mystery, and lure were like webs that had been woven upon my brain, and which I could not dissipate by any amount of conscious effort. I made 2 resolves, however. One was that I should write immediately to Amberville's fiancée, Miss Avis Olcott, and invite her to visit me as a fellow guest of the artist during the remainder of his stay at Bowman. Her influence, I thought, might help to counteract whatever was affecting him so perniciously. Since I knew her fairly well, the invitation would not seem out of the way. I decided to say nothing about it to Amberville. The element of surprise, I hoped, would be especially beneficial. My second resolve was that I should not again visit the meadow myself, if I could avoid it. Indirectly, for I knew the folly of trying to combat a mental obsession openly, I should also try to discourage the painter's interest in the place, and divert his attention to other themes. Trips and entertainments, too, could be devised, at the minor cost of delaying my own work. The smoky autumn twilight overtook me in such meditations as these, but Amberville did not return. Horrible premonitions, without coherent shape or name, began to torment me as I waited for him. The night darkened, and dinner grew cold on the table. At last, about 9 o'clock, when I was nerving myself to go out and hunt for him, he came in hurriedly. He was pale, dishevelled, out of breath, and his eyes held a painful glare, as if something had frightened him beyond endurance. He did not apologize for his lateness, nor did he refer to my own visit to the meadow bottom. Apparently he had forgotten the whole episode, had forgotten his rudeness to me. "I'm through," he cried. "I'll never go back again, never take another chance. That place is more hellish at night than in the daytime. I can't tell you what I've seen and felt. I must forget it if I can. There's an emanation, something that comes out openly in the absence of the sun, but is latent by day. It lured me, it tempted me to remain this evening, and it nearly got me. God, I didn't believe that such things were possible, that abhorrent compound of—" He broke off and did not finish the sentence. His eyes dilated, as if with a memory of something too awful to be described. At that moment, I recalled the poisonously haunted eyes of old Chapman, whom I had sometimes met about the hamlet. He had not interested me particularly, since I had deemed him a common type of rural character, with a tendency to some obscure and unpleasant aberration. Now, when I saw the same look in the eyes of a sensitive artist, I began to wonder, with a shivering speculation, whether Chapman too had been aware of the weird evil that dwelt in his meadow. Perhaps, in some way that was beyond human comprehension, he had been its victim. He had died there, and his death had not seemed at all mysterious. But perhaps, in the light of all that Amberville and I had perceived, there was more in the matter than anyone had suspected. "Tell me what you saw," I ventured to suggest. At the question, a veil seemed to fall between us, impalpable but tenebrific. He shook his head morosely and made no reply. The human terror, which perhaps had driven him back toward his normal self and had made him almost communicative for the nonce, fell away from Amberville. A shadow that was darker than fear, an impenetrable alien umbrage, again submerged him. I felt a sudden chill, of the spirit rather than the flesh, and once more there came to me the outre thought of his growing kinship with the ghoulish meadow. Beside me, in the lamplit room behind the mask of his humanity, a thing that was not wholly human seemed to sit and wait. Of the nightmarish days that followed, I shall offer only a summary. It would be impossible to convey the eventless, phantasmal horror in which we dwelt and moved. I wrote immediately to Miss Olcott, pressing her to pay me a visit during Amberville's stay, and, in order to ensure acceptance, I hinted obscurely at my concern for his health and my need of her coadjutation. In the meanwhile, waiting her answer, I tried to divert the artist by suggesting trips to sundry points of scenic interest in the neighborhood. These suggestions he declined with an aloof curtness, an air that was stony and cryptic, rather than deliberately rude. Virtually, he ignored my existence, and made it more than plain that he wished me to leave him to his own devices. This, in despair, I finally decided to do, pending the arrival of Miss Olcott. He went out early each morning as usual with his paints and easel, and returned about sunset or a little later. He did not tell me where he had been, and I refrained from asking. Miss Olcott came on the third day following my letter in the afternoon. She was young, lissom, ultra-feminine, and was altogether devoted to Amberville. In fact, I think she was a little in awe of him. I told her as much as I dared, and warned her of the morbid change in her fiancé, which I attributed to nervousness and overwork. I simply could not bring myself to mention Chapman's Meadow, and its baleful influence. The whole thing was too unbelievable, too phantasmagoric, to be offered as an explanation to a modern girl. When I saw the somewhat helpless alarm and bewilderment with which she listened to my story, I began to wish that she were of a more willful and determined type, and were less submissive toward Amberville than I surmised her to be. A stronger woman might have saved him, but even then I began to doubt whether Avis could do anything to combat the imponderable evil that was engulfing him. A heavy crescent moon was hanging like a blood-dipped horn in the twilight when he returned. To my immense relief, the presence of Avis appeared to have a highly salutary effect. The very moment that he saw her, Amberville came out of the singular eclipse that had claimed him, as I feared beyond redemption, and was almost his former affable self. Perhaps it was all make-believe for an ulterior purpose, but this, at the time, I could not suspect. I began to congratulate myself on having applied a sovereign remedy. The girl, on her part, was plainly relieved, though I saw her eyeing him in a slightly hurt and puzzled way, when he sometimes fell for a short interval into moody abstraction, as if he had temporarily forgotten her. On the whole, however, there was a transformation that appeared no less than magical, in view of his recent gloom and remoteness. After a decent interim, I left the pair together, and retired. I rose very late the next morning, having overslept. Avis and Amberville, I learned, had gone out together, carrying a lunch which my Chinese cook had provided. Plainly he was taking her along on one of his artistic expeditions, and I augured well for his recovery from this. Somehow it never occurred to me that he had taken her to Chapman's Meadow. The tenuous, malignant shadow of the whole affair had begun to lift from my mind. I rejoiced in a lightened sense of responsibility, and, for the first time in a week, was able to concentrate clearly on the ending of my novel. The two returned at dusk, and I saw immediately that I had been mistaken on more points than one. Amberville had again retired into a sinister, saturnine reserve. The girl, beside his looming height and massive shoulders, looked very small, forlorn, and pitifully bewildered and frightened. It was as if she had encountered something altogether beyond her comprehension, something with which she was humanly powerless to cope. Very little was said by either of them. They did not tell me where they had been, but, for that matter, it was unnecessary to inquire. Amberville's taciturnity, as usual, seemed due to an absorption in some dark mood or sullen reverie, but Avis gave me the impression of a dual constraint, as if, apart from some enthralling terror, she had been forbidden to speak of the day's events and experiences. I knew that they had gone to that accursed meadow, but I was far from sure whether Avis had been personally conscious of the weird and baneful entity of the place, or had merely been frightened by the unwholesome change in her lover beneath its influence. In either case, it was obvious that she was wholly subservient to him. I began to damn myself for a fool in having invited her to Bowman, though the true bitterness of my regret was still to come. A week went by, with the same daily excursions of the painter and his fiancée, the same baffling, sinister estrangement and secrecy in Amberville, the same terror, helplessness, constraint, and submissiveness in the girl. How it would all end, I could not imagine, but I feared, from the ominous alteration of his character, that Amberville was heading for some form of mental alienation, if nothing worse. My offers of entertainment and scenic journeys were rejected by the pair, and several blunt efforts to question Avis were met by a wall of almost hostile evasion which convinced me that Amberville had enjoined her to secrecy, and had perhaps, in some slightful manner, misrepresented my own attitude toward him. "You don't understand him," she said repeatedly. "He is very temperamental." The whole affair was a maddening mystery, but it seemed more and more that the girl herself was being drawn either directly or indirectly into the same phantasmal web that had enmeshed the artist. I surmised that Amberville had done several new pictures of the meadow, but he did not show them to me, nor even mention them. My own impressions of the place, as time went on, assumed an unaccountable vividness that was almost hallucinatory. The incredible idea of some inherent force or personality, malevolent and even vampirish, became an unavowed conviction against my will. The place haunted me like a phantasm, horrible but seductive. I felt an impelling morbid curiosity, an unwholesome desire to visit it again, and fathom, if possible, its enigma. Often I thought of Amberville's notion about a genius loci that dwelt in the meadow, and the hints of a human apparition that was somehow associated with the spot. Also, I wondered what it was that the artist had seen on the one occasion when he had lingered in the meadow after nightfall, and had returned to my house in driven terror. It seemed that he had not ventured to repeat the experiment, in spite of his obvious objection to the unknown lure. The end came abruptly and without premonition. Business had taken me to the county seat one afternoon, and I did not return till late in the evening. A full moon was high above the pine-dark hills. I expected to find Avis and the painter in my drawing-room, but they were not there. Leasing, my factotum, told me that they had returned at dinner-time. An hour later, Amberville had gone out quietly while the girl was in her room. Coming down a few minutes later, Avis had shown excessive perturbation when she found him absent, and had also left the house as if to follow him, without telling Leasing where she was going or when she might return. All this had occurred 3 hours previously, and neither of the pair had yet reappeared. A black and subtly chilling intuition of evil seized me as I listened to Leasing's account. All too well, I surmised that Amberville had yielded to the temptation of a second nocturnal visit to that unholy meadow. An occult attraction, somehow, had overcome the horror of his first experience, whatever it had been. Avis, knowing where he was, and perhaps fearful of his sanity or safety, had gone out to find him. More and more I felt an imperative conviction of some peril that threatened them both, some hideous and innominable thing to whose power, perhaps, they had already yielded. Whatever my previous folly and remissness in the matter, I did not delay now. A few minutes of driving at precipitate speed through the mellow moonlight brought me to the piney edge of the Chapman property. There, as on my former visit, I left the car and plunged headlong through the shadowy forest. Far down in the hollow as I went, I heard a single scream, shrill with terror, and abruptly terminated. I felt sure that the voice was that of Avis, but I did not hear it again. Running desperately, I emerged in the meadow bottom. Neither Avis nor Amberville was in sight, and it seemed to me, in my hasty scrutiny, that the place was full of mysteriously coiling and moving vapors that permitted only a partial view of the dead willow and the other vegetation. I ran on toward the scummy pool, and nearing it, was arrested by a sudden and twofold horror. Avis and Amberville were floating together in the shallow pool, with their bodies half hidden by the mantling masses of algae. The girl was clasped tightly in the painter's arms, as if he had carried her with him against her will to that noisome death. Her face was covered by the evil greenish scum, and I could not see the face of Amberville, which was averted against her shoulder. It seemed that there had been a struggle, but both were quiet now, and had yielded supinely to their doom. It was not this spectacle alone, however, that drove me in mad and shuddering flight from the meadow without making even the most tentative attempt to retrieve the drowned bodies. The true horror lay in the thing which, from a little distance, I had taken for the coils of a slowly moving and rising mist. It was not vapor, nor anything else that could conceivably exist, that malign, luminous, pallid emanation that enfolded the entire scene before me like a restless and hungrily wavering extension of its outlines, a phantom projection of the pale and death-like willow, the dying alders, the reeds, the stagnant pool, and its suicidal victims. The landscape was visible through it, as through a film, but it seemed to curdle and thicken gradually in places with some unholy, terrifying activity. Out of these curdlings, as if disgorged by the ambient exhalation, I saw the emergence of 3 human faces that partook of the same nebulous matter, neither mist nor plasm. One of these faces seemed to detach itself from the bowl of the ghostly willow. The second and third swirled upward from the seething of the phantom pool, with their bodies trailing formlessly among the tenuous boughs. The faces were those of old Chapman, of Francis Amberville, and Avis Olcott. Behind this eerie, wraith-like projection of itself, the actual landscape leered with the same infernal and vampirish air which it had worn by day. But it seemed now that the place was no longer still, that it seethed with a malignant secret life, that it reached out toward me with its scummy waters, with the bony fingers of its trees, with the spectral faces it had spewed forth from its lethal deadfall. Even terror was frozen within me for a moment. I stood watching, while the pale, unhallowed exhalation rose higher above the meadow. The 3 human faces, through a further agitation of the curdling mass, began to approach each other. Slowly, inexpressibly, they merged in one, becoming an androgynous face, neither young nor old, that melted finally into the lengthening phantom boughs of the willow, the hands of the arboreal death that were reaching out to enfold me. Then, unable to bear the spectacle any longer, I started to run. There is little more that need be told, for nothing that I could add to this narrative would lessen the abominable mystery of it all in any degree. The meadow, or the thing that dwells in the meadow, has already claimed 3 victims, and I sometimes wonder if it will have a 4th. I alone, it would seem, among the living have guessed the secret of Chapman's death, and the death of Avis and Amberville, and no one else apparently has felt the malign genius of the meadow. I have not returned there since the morning when the bodies of the artist and his fiancée were removed from the pool, nor have I summoned up the resolution to destroy or otherwise dispose of the 4 oil paintings and 2 watercolor drawings of the spot that were made by Amberville. Perhaps, in spite of all that deters me, I shall visit it again. Demons of the Sea by William Hope Hodgson. "Come out on deck and have a look, Darky," Jepson cried, rushing into the half-deck. "The old man says there's been a submarine earthquake, and the sea's all bubbling and muddy." Obeying the summons of Jepson's excited tone, I followed him out. It was as he had said. The everlasting blue of the ocean was mottled with splotches of a muddy hue, and at times a large bubble would appear to burst with a loud pop. Aft, the skipper and the 3 mates could be seen on the poop, peering at the sea through their glasses. As I gazed out over the gently heaving water, far off to windward, something was hove up into the evening air. It appeared to be a mass of seaweed, but fell back into the water with a sullen plunge, as though it were something more substantial. Immediately after this strange occurrence, the sun set with tropical swiftness, and in the brief afterglow things assumed a strange unreality. The crew were all below, no one but the mate and the helmsman remaining on the poop. Away forward, on the topgallant forecastle head, the dim figure of the man on lookout could be seen, leaning against the forestay. No sound was heard, save the occasional jingle of a chain-sheet, of the flog of the steering gear as a small swell passed under our counter. Presently the mate's voice broke the silence, and, looking up, I saw that the old man had come on deck and was talking with him. From the few stray words that could be overheard, I knew they were talking of the strange happenings of the day. Shortly after sunset, the wind, which had been fresh during the day, died down, and with its passing the air grew oppressively hot. Not long after 2 bells, the mate sung out for me, and ordered me to fill a bucket from overside and bring it to him. When I had carried out his instructions, he placed a thermometer in the bucket. "Just as I thought," he muttered, removing the instrument and showing it to the skipper. 99 degrees. Why, the sea's hot enough to make tea with." "Hope it doesn't get any hotter," growled the latter. "If it does, we shall all be boiled alive." At a sign from the mate, I emptied the bucket and replaced it in the rack, after which I resumed my former position by the rail. The old man and the mate walked the poop side by side. The air grew hotter as the hours passed, and after a long period of silence, broken only by the occasional pop of a bursting gas bubble, the moon arose. It shed but a feeble light, however, as a heavy mist had arisen from the sea, and through this the moonbeam struggled weakly. The mist, we decided, was due to the excessive heat of the sea water. It was a very wet mist, and we were soon soaked to the skin. Slowly, the interminable night wore on, and the sun arose, looking dim and ghostly through the mist that rolled and billowed about the ship. From time to time we took the temperature of the sea, although we found but a slight increase therein. No work was done, and a feeling as of something impending pervaded the ship. The foghorn was kept going constantly, as the lookout peered through the wreathing mists. The captain walked the poop in company with the mates, and once the third mate spoke and pointed out into the clouds of fog. All eyes followed his gesture. We saw what was apparently a black line which seemed to cut the whiteness of the billows. It reminded us of nothing so much as an enormous cobra standing on its tail. As we looked, it vanished. The grouped mates were evidently puzzled. There seemed to be a difference of opinion among them. Presently, as they argued, I heard the second mate's voice. "That's all rot," he said. "I've seen things in fog before, but they've always turned out to be imaginary." The third shook his head and made some reply I could not overhear, but no further comment was made. Going below that afternoon, I got a short sleep, and on coming on deck at 8 bells, I found that the steam still held us. If anything, it seemed to be thicker than ever. Hansard, who had been taking the temperatures during my watch below, informed me that the sea was 3 degrees hotter, and that the old man was getting into a rare old state. At 3 bells I went forward to have a look over the bows and a chin with Stevenson, whose lookout it was. On gaining the forecastle head, I went to the side and looked down into the water. Stevenson came over and stood beside me. "Rum go, this," he grumbled. He stood by my side for a time in silence. We seemed to be hypnotized by the gleaming surface of the sea. Suddenly, out of the depths, right before us, there arose a monstrous black face. It was like a frightful caricature of a human countenance. For a moment we gazed, petrified. My blood seemed to suddenly turn to ice water. I was unable to move. With a mighty effort of will, I regained my self-control, and, grasping Stevenson's arm, I found I could do no more than croak. My powers of speech seemed gone. "Look!" I gasped. "Look!" Stevenson continued to stare into the sea, like a man turned to stone. He seemed to stoop further over, as if to examine the thing more closely. "Lord!" he exclaimed. "It must be the devil himself." As though the sound of his voice had broken a spell, the thing disappeared. My companion looked at me, while I rubbed my eyes, thinking that I had been asleep and that the awful vision had been a frightful nightmare. One look at my friend, however, disabused me of any such thought. His face wore a puzzled expression. "Better go aft and tell the old man," he faltered. I nodded and left the forecastle head, making my way aft like one in a trance. The skipper and the mate were standing at the break of the poop, and running up the ladder I told them what we had seen. "Bosh!" sneered the old man. "You've been looking at your own ugly reflection in the water." Nevertheless, in spite of his ridicule, he questioned me closely. Finally, he ordered the mate forward to see if he could see anything. The latter, however, returned in a few moments to report that nothing unusual could be seen. 4 bells were struck, and we were relieved for tea. Coming on deck afterward, I found the men clustered together forward. The sole topic of conversation with them was the thing that Stevenson and I had seen. "I suppose, Doc, it couldn't have been a reflection by any chance, could it?" one of the older men asked. "Ask Stevenson," I replied, as I made my way aft. At 8 bells, my watch came on deck again, to find that nothing further had developed. But about an hour before midnight, The mate, thinking to have a smoke, sent me to his room for a box of matches with which to light his pipe. It took me no time to clatter down the brass-treaded ladder and back to the poop, where I handed him the desired article. Taking the box, he removed a match and struck it on the heel of his boot. As he did so, far out in the night, a muffled screaming arose. Then came a clamor as of hoarse braying, like an ass, but considerably deeper, and with a horribly suggestive human note running through it. "Good God, did you hear that, darky?" asked the mate in awed tones. "Yes, sir," I replied, listening, and scarcely noticing his question, for a repetition of the strange sounds. Suddenly, the frightful bellowing broke out afresh. The mate's pipe fell to the deck with a clatter. "Run forward," he cried. "Quick now, and see if you can see anything." With my heart in my mouth and pulses pounding madly, I raced forward. The watch were all up on the forecastle head, clustered around the lookout. Each man was talking and gesticulating wildly. They became silent and turned questioning glances toward me as I shouldered my way among them. "Have you seen anything?" I cried. Before I could receive an answer, a repetition of the horrid sounds broke out again, profaning the night with their horror. They seemed to have definite direction now, in spite of the fog that enveloped us. Undoubtedly, too, they were nearer. Pausing a moment to make sure of their bearing, I hastened aft and reported to the mate. I told him that nothing could be seen, but that the sounds apparently came from right ahead of us. On hearing this, he ordered the man at the wheel to let the ship's head come off a couple of points. A moment later, a shrill screaming tore its way through the night, followed by the hoarse braying sounds once more. "It's close on the starboard bow," exclaimed the mate as he beckoned the helmsman to let her head come off a little more. Then, singing out for the watch, he ran forward, slacking the lee braces on the way. When he had the yards trimmed to his satisfaction on the new course, he returned to the poop and hung far out over the rail, listening intently. Moments passed that seemed like hours, yet the silence remained unbroken. Suddenly, the sounds began again, and so close that it seemed as though they must be right aboard of us. At this time, I noticed a strange booming note mingled with the brays, and once or twice there came a sound that can only be described as a sort of gug, gug. Then would come a wheezy whistling, for all the world like an asthmatic person breathing. All this while the moon shone wanly through the steam, which seemed to me to be somewhat thinner. Once the mate gripped me by the shoulder as the noises rose and fell again. They now seemed to be coming from a point broad on our beam. Every eye on the ship was straining into the mist, but with no result. Suddenly one of the men cried out, as something long and black slid past us into the fog astern. From it there rose 4 indistinct and ghostly towers, which resolved themselves into spars and ropes and sails. "A ship! It's a ship!" we cried excitedly. I turned to Mr. Gray. He too had seen something, and was staring aft into the wake. So ghost-like, unreal, and fleeting had been our glimpse of the stranger, that we were not sure that we had seen an honest, material ship, but thought that we had been vouchsafed a vision of some phantom vessel like the Flying Dutchman. Our sails gave a sudden flap, the clew irons flogging the bulwarks with hollow thumps. The mate glanced aloft. "Wind's dropping," he growled savagely. "We shall never get out of this infernal place at this gait." Gradually the wind fell until it was a flat calm. No sound broke the death-like silence save the rapid patter of the reef points as she gently rose and fell on the light swell. Hours passed, and the watch was relieved, and I then went below. At 7 bells we were called again, and as I went along the deck to the galley, I noticed that the fog seemed thinner and the air cooler. When 8 bells were struck, I relieved Hansard at coiling down the ropes. From him, I learned that the steam had begun to clear about 4 bells, and that the temperature of the sea had fallen 10 degrees. In spite of the thinning mist, it was not until about a half an hour later that we were able to get a glimpse of the surrounding sea. It was still mottled with dark patches, but the bubbling and popping had ceased. As much of the surface of the ocean as could be seen had a peculiarly desolate aspect. Occasionally a wisp of steam would float up from the nearer sea, and roll undulatingly across its silent surface, until lost in the vagueness that still held the hidden horizon. Here and there, columns of steam rose up in pillars, which gave me the impression that the sea was hot in patches. Crossing to the starboard side and looking over, I found that conditions there were similar to those to port. The desolate aspect of the sea filled me with an idea of chilliness, although the air was quite warm and muggy. From the break of the poop, the mate called me to get his glasses. When I had done this, he took them from me and walked to the taffrail. Here he stood for some moments polishing them with his handkerchief. After a moment, he raised them to his eyes and peered long and intently into the mist astern. I stood for some time, staring at the point on which the mate had focused his glasses. Presently, something shadowy grew upon my vision. Steadily watching it, I distinctly saw the outlines of a ship take form in the fog. "See?" I cried. But even as I spoke, a lifting wraith of mist disclosed to view a great four-masted bark lying becalmed with all sails set within a few hundred yards of our stern. As though a curtain had been raised and then allowed to fall, the fog once more settled down, hiding the strange bark from our sight. The mate was all excitement, striding with quick, jerky steps up and down the poop, stopping every few moments to peer through his glasses at the point where the foremaster had disappeared in the fog. Gradually, as the mist dispersed again, the vessel could be seen more plainly, and it was then that we got an inkling of the cause of the dreadful noises during the night. For some time the mate watched her silently, and as he watched, the conviction grew upon me that in spite of the mist, I could detect some sort of movement on board of her. After some time had passed, the doubt became a certainty, and I could also see a sort of splashing in the water alongside of her. Suddenly, the mate put his glasses on top of the wheelbox and told me to bring him the speaking trumpet. Running to the companionway, I secured the trumpet and was back at his side. The mate raised it to his lips and, taking a deep breath, sent a hail across the water that should have awakened the dead. We waited tensely for a reply. A moment later, a deep, hollow mutter came from the bark. Higher and louder it swelled, until we realized that we were listening to the same sounds we had heard the night before. The mate stood aghast at this answer to his hail. In a voice barely more than a hushed whisper, he bade me call the old man. Attracted by the mate's hail and its unearthly reply, the watch had all come aft and were clustered in the mizzen rigging, in order to see better. After calling the captain, I returned to the poop, where I found the second and third mates talking with the chief. All were engaged in trying to pierce the clouds of mist that half hid our strange consort, and to arrive at some explanation of the strange phenomena of the past few hours. A moment later, the captain appeared carrying his telescope. The mate gave him a brief account of the state of affairs and handed him the trumpet. Giving me the telescope to hold, the captain hailed the shadowy bark. Breathlessly we all listened, when again, in answer to the old man's hail, the frightful sounds rose on the still morning air. The skipper lowered the trumpet and stood with an expression of astonished horror on his face. "Lord!" he exclaimed. "What an ungodly row!" At this, the third, who had been gazing through his binoculars, broke the silence. "Look!" he ejaculated. "There's a breeze coming up astern." At his words, the captain looked up quickly, and we all watched the ruffling water. "That packet yonder is bringing the breeze with her," said the skipper. "She'll be alongside in half an hour." Some moments passed, and the bank of fog had come to within 100 yards of our taffrail. The strange vessel could be distinctly seen just inside the fringe of the driving mist wreaths. After a short puff, the wind died completely, but as we stared with hypnotic fascination, the water astern of the stranger ruffled again with a fresh cat's paw. Seemingly with the flapping of her sails, she drew slowly up to us. As the leaden seconds passed, the big foremaster approached us steadily. The light air had now reached us, and with a lazy lift of our sails, we too began to forge slowly through that weird sea. The bark was now within 50 yards of our stern, and she was steadily drawing nearer, seeming to be able to outfoot us with ease. As she came on, she laughed sharply, and came up into the wind with her weather leeches shaking. I looked toward her poop, thinking to discern the figure of the man at the wheel, but the mist coiled around her quarter, and objects on the after end of her became indistinguishable. With a rattle of chain sheets on her iron yard, she filled away again. We meanwhile had gone ahead, but it was soon evident that she was the better sailor, for she came up to us hand over fist. The wind rapidly freshened, and the mist began to drift away before it, so that each moment her spars and cordage became more plainly visible. The skipper and the mates were watching her intently, when an almost simultaneous exclamation of fear broke from them. "My God!" And well they might show signs of fear, for crawling about the bark's deck were the most horrible creatures I had ever seen. In spite of their unearthly strangeness, there was something vaguely familiar about them. Then it came to me that the face that Stevenson and I had seen during the night belonged to one of them. Their bodies had something of the shape of a seal's, but of a dead, unhealthy white. The lower part of the body ended in a sort of double-curved tail, on which they appeared to be able to shuffle about. In place of arms, they had two long, snaky feelers, at the ends of which were two very human-like hands, which were equipped with talons instead of nails. Fearsome indeed were these parodies of human beings. Their faces, which, like their tentacles, were black, were the most grotesquely human things about them, and the upper jaw closed into the lower, after the manner of the jaws of an octopus. I have seen men among certain tribes of natives who had faces uncommonly like theirs, but yet no native I had ever seen could have given me the extraordinary feeling of horror and revulsion I experienced toward these brutal-looking creatures. "What devilish beasts!" burst out the captain in disgust. With this remark he turned to the mates, and as he did so, the expressions on their faces told me that they had all realized what the presence of these bestial-looking brutes meant. If, as was doubtless the case, these creatures had boarded the bark and destroyed her crew, what would prevent them from doing the same with us? We were a smaller ship and had a smaller crew, and the more I thought of it, the less I liked it. We could now see the name of the bark's bow with the naked eye. It read Scottish Heath, while on her boats we could see the name bracketed with Glasgow, showing that she hailed from that port. It was a remarkable coincidence that she should have a slant from just the quarter in which yards were trimmed, as before we saw her she must have been drifting around with everything aback. But now in this light air she was able to run along beside us with no one at her helm. But steering herself she was, and although at times she yawed wildly, she never got herself aback. As we gazed at her, we noticed a sudden movement on board of her, and several of the creatures slid into the water. See, they've spotted us. They're coming for us," cried the mate wildly. It was only too true. Scores of them were sliding into the sea, letting themselves down by means of their long tentacles. On they came, slipping by scores and hundreds into the water, and swimming toward us in droves. The ship was making about 3 knots, otherwise they would have caught us in a very few minutes. But they persevered, gaining slowly but surely, and drawing nearer and nearer. The long tentacle-like arms rose out of the sea in hundreds, and the foremost ones were already within a score of yards of the ship, before the old man bethought himself to shout to the mates to fetch up the half-dozen cutlasses that comprised the ship's armory. Then, turning to me, he ordered me to go down to his cabin and bring up the 2 revolvers out of the top drawer of the chart table, also a box of cartridges that was there. When I returned with the weapons, he loaded them and handed one to the mate. Meanwhile, the pursuing creatures were coming steadily nearer, and soon 6 of the leaders were directly under our counter. Immediately, the captain leaned over the rail and emptied his pistol into them, but without any apparent effect. He must have realized how puny and ineffectual his efforts were, for he did not reload his weapon. Some dozens of the brutes had reached us, and as they did so, their tentacles rose into the air and caught our rail. I heard the 3rd mate scream suddenly, and turning, I saw him dragged quickly to the rail, with a tentacle wrapped completely around him. Snatching a cutlass, the 2nd mate hacked off the tentacle where it joined the body. A gout of blood splashed into the 3rd mate's face, and he fell to the deck. 12 more of those arms rose and wavered in the air. but they now seemed some yards astern of us. A rapidly widening patch of clear water appeared between us and the foremost of our pursuers, and we raised a wild shout of joy. The cause was soon apparent, for a fine fair wind had sprung up, and with the increase in its force, the Scottish Heath had got herself aback, while we were rapidly leaving the monsters behind us. The third mate rose to his feet with a dazed look, and as he did so, something fell to the deck. I picked it up, and found that it was the severed portion of the tentacle of the third's late adversary. With a grimace of disgust, I tossed it into the sea, as I needed no reminder of that awful experience. 3 weeks later, we anchored in San Francisco. There, the captain made a full report of the affair to the authorities, with the result that a gunboat was dispatched to investigate. 6 weeks later, she returned to report that she had been unable to find any signs, either of the ship herself or of the fearful creatures that had attacked her. And since then, nothing, as far as I know, has ever been heard of the four-masted bark Scottish Heath, last seen by us in the possession of creatures that may rightly be called demons of the sea. Whether she still floats, occupied by her hellish crew, or whether some storm has sent her to her last resting place beneath the waves, is surely a matter of conjecture. Perchance, on some dark, fog-bound night, a ship in that wilderness of waters may hear cries and sounds beyond those of the wailing of the winds. Then let them look to it, for it may be that the demons of the sea are near them. The Horror of the Heights by Arthur Conan Doyle. The idea that the extraordinary narrative which has been called the Joyce Armstrong fragment is an elaborate practical joke evolved by some unknown person, cursed by a perverted and sinister sense of humor, has now been abandoned by all who have examined the matter. The most macabre and imaginative of plotters would hesitate before linking his morbid fancies with the unquestioned and tragic facts which reinforce the statement. Though the assertions contained in it are amazing and even monstrous, it is none the less forcing itself upon the general intelligence that they are true, and that we must readjust our ideas to the new situation. This world of ours appears to be separated by a slight and precarious margin of safety from a most singular and unexpected danger. I will endeavor in this narrative, which reproduces the original document in its necessarily somewhat fragmentary form, to lay before the reader the whole of the facts up to date, prefacing my statement by saying that, if there be any who doubt the narrative of Joyce Armstrong, there can be no question at all as to the facts concerning Lieutenant Myrtle, R.N., and Mr. Hay Connor, who undoubtedly met their end in the manner described. The Joyce Armstrong fragment was found in the field which is called Lower Haycock, lying 1 mile to the westward of the village of Withyham, upon the Kent and Sussex border. It was on the 15th September last that an agricultural labourer, James Flynn, in the employment of Matthew Dodd, farmer, of the Chauntry Farm, Withyham, perceived a briar pipe lying near the footpath which skirts the hedge in Lower Haycock. A few paces farther on, he picked up a pair of broken binocular glasses. Finally, among some nettles in the ditch, he caught sight of a flat, canvas-backed book, which proved to be a notebook with detachable leaves, some of which had come loose and were fluttering along the base of the hedge. These he collected, but some, including the first, were never recovered, and leave a deplorable hiatus in this all-important statement. The notebook was taken by the labourer to his master, who in turn showed it to Dr. J. H. Atherton of Hartfield. This gentleman at once recognized the need for an expert examination, and the manuscript was forwarded to the Aero Club in London, where it now lies. The first 2 pages of the manuscript are missing. There is also one torn away at the end of the narrative, though none of these affect the general coherence of the story. It is conjectured that the missing opening is concerned with a record of Mr. Joyce Armstrong's qualifications as an aeronaut, which can be gathered from other sources and are admitted to be unsurpassed among the air pilots of England. For many years he has been looked upon as among the most daring and the most intellectual of flying men, a combination which has enabled him to both invent and test several new devices, including the common gyroscopic attachment which is known by his name. The main body of the manuscript is written neatly in ink, but the last few lines are in pencil and are so ragged as to be hardly legible, exactly, in fact, as they might be expected to appear if they were scribbled off hurriedly from the seat of a moving aeroplane. There are, it may be added, several stains, both on the last page and on the outside cover, which have been pronounced by the Home Office experts to be blood, probably human and certainly mammalian. The fact that something closely resembling the organism of malaria was discovered in this blood, and that Joyce Armstrong is known to have suffered from intermittent fever, is a remarkable example of the new weapons which modern science has placed in the hands of our detectives. And now a word as to the personality of the author of this epoch-making statement. Joyce Armstrong, according to the few friends who really knew something of the man, was a poet and a dreamer, as well as a mechanic and an inventor. He was a man of considerable wealth, much of which he had spent in the pursuit of his aeronautical hobby. He had 4 private aeroplanes in his hangars near Devizes, and is said to have made no fewer than 170 ascents in the course of last year. He was a retiring man with dark moods, in which he would avoid the society of his fellows. Captain Dangerfield, who knew him better than anyone, says that there were times when his eccentricity threatened to develop into something more serious. His habit of carrying a shotgun with him in his aeroplane was one manifestation of it. Another was the morbid effect which the fall of Lieutenant Myrtle had upon his mind. Myrtle, who was attempting the height record, fell from an altitude of something over 30,000 feet. Horrible to narrate. His head was entirely obliterated, though his body and limbs preserved their configuration. At every gathering of airmen, Joyce Armstrong, according to Dangerfield, would ask with an enigmatic smile, "And where, pray, is Myrtle's head?" On another occasion, after dinner, at the mess of the flying school on Salisbury Plain, he started a debate as to what will be the most permanent danger which airmen will have to encounter. Having listened to successive opinions as to air pockets, faulty construction, and overbanking, he ended by shrugging his shoulders and refusing to put forward his own views, though he gave the impression that they differed from any advanced by his companions. It is worth remarking that, after his own complete disappearance, it was found that his private affairs were arranged with a precision which may show that he had a strong premonition of disaster. With these essential explanations, I will now give the narrative exactly as it stands, beginning at page 3 of the blood-soaked notebook. Nevertheless, when I dined at Ross with Caselli and Gustav Raymond, I found that neither of them was aware of any particular danger in the higher layers of the atmosphere. I did not actually say what was in my thoughts, but I got so near to it that if they had any corresponding idea, they could not have failed to express it. But then they are 2 empty, vainglorious fellows, with no thought beyond seeing their silly names in the newspaper. It is interesting to note that neither of them had ever been much beyond the 20,000-foot level. Of course, men have been higher than this, both in balloons and in the ascent of mountains. It must be well above that point that the aeroplane enters the danger zone, always presuming that my premonitions are correct. Aeroplaning has been with us now for more than 20 years, and one might well ask, why should this peril be only revealing itself in our day? The answer is obvious. In the old days of weak engines, when 100-horsepower Gnome or Green was considered ample for every need, the flights were very restricted. Now that 300 horsepower is the rule rather than the exception, visits to the upper layers have become easier and more common. Some of us can remember how, in our youth, Garrus made a worldwide reputation by attaining 19,000 feet, and it was considered a remarkable achievement to fly over the Alps. Our standard now has been immeasurably raised, and there are 20 high flights for one in former years. Many of them have been undertaken with impunity. The 30,000-foot level has been reached time after time with no discomfort, beyond cold and asthma. What does this prove? A visitor might descend upon this planet 1,000 times and never see a tiger. Yet tigers exist, and if he chanced to come down into a jungle, he might be devoured. There are jungles of the upper air, and there are worse things than tigers which inhabit them. I believe in time they will map these jungles accurately out. Even at the present moment I could name two of them. One of them lies over the Bierce district of France. Another is just over my head as I write here in my house in Wiltshire. I rather think there is a third in the Homburg-Wiesbaden district. It was the disappearance of the airman that first set me thinking. Of course, everyone said that they had fallen into the sea, but that did not satisfy me at all. First, there was Verrier in France. His machine was found near Bayonne, but they never got his body. There was the case of Baxter also, who vanished, though his engine and some of the iron fixings were found in a wood in Leicestershire. In that case, Dr. Middleton of Amesbury, who was watching the flight with a telescope, declares that just before the clouds obscured the view, he saw the machine, which was at an enormous height, suddenly rise perpendicularly upwards in a succession of jerks in a manner that he would have thought to be impossible. That was the last seen of Baxter. There was a correspondence in the papers, but it never led to anything. There were several other similar cases, and then there was the death of Hay Connor. What a cackle there was about an unsolved mystery of the air, and what columns in the halfpenny papers, and yet how little was ever done to get to the bottom of the business. He came down in a tremendous volplane from an unknown height. He never got off his machine and died in his pilot's seat. Died of what? Heart disease, said the doctors. Rubbish. Hay Connor's heart was as sound as mine is. What did Venables say? Venables was the only man who was at his side when he died. He said that he was shivering and looked like a man who had been badly scared. Died of fright, said Venables, but could not imagine what he was frightened about. Only said one word to Venables, which sounded like monstrous. They could make nothing of that at the inquest, but I could make something of it. Monsters. That was the last word of poor Harry Hay Connor, and he did die of fright, just as Venables thought. And then there was Myrtle's head. Do you really believe, does anybody really believe that a man's head could be driven clean into his body by the force of a fall? Well, perhaps it may be possible, but I, for one, have never believed that it was so with Myrtle. And the grease upon his clothes, all slimy with grease, said somebody at the inquest. Queer that nobody got thinking after that. I did, but then I'd been thinking for a good long time. I've made 3 ascents. How Dangerfield used to chaff me about my shotgun, but I've never been high enough. Now, with this new light Paul Verner machine and its 175 Rober, I should easily touch the 30,000 tomorrow. I'll have a shot at the record. Maybe I shall have a shot at something else as well. Of course, it's dangerous. If a fellow wants to avoid danger, he had best keep out of flying altogether, and subside finally into flannel slippers and a dressing gown. But I'll visit the air jungle tomorrow, and if there's anything there, I shall know it. If I return, I'll find myself a bit of a celebrity. If I don't, this notebook may explain what I'm trying to do, and how I lost my life in doing it. But no drivel about accidents or mysteries, if you please. I chose my Paul Verner monoplane for the job. There's nothing like a monoplane when real work is to be done. Beaumont found that out in very early days. For one thing, it doesn't mind damp, and the weather looks as if we should be in the clouds all the time. It's a bonny little model, and answers my hand like a tender-mouthed horse. The engine is a 10-cylinder rotary Rober, working up to 175. It has all the modern improvements, enclosed fuselage, high-curved landing skids, brakes, gyroscopic steadiers, and 3 speeds, worked by an alteration of the angle of the planes upon the Venetian blind principle. I took a shotgun with me and a dozen cartridges filled with buckshot. You should have seen the face of Perkins, my old mechanic, when I directed him to put them in. I was dressed like an Arctic explorer, with 2 jerseys under my overalls, thick socks inside my padded boots, a storm cap with flaps, and my talc goggles. It was stifling outside the hangars, but I was going for the summit of the Himalayas, and had to dress for the part. Perkins knew there was something on, and implored me to take him with me. Perhaps I should, if I were using the biplane, but a monoplane is a one-man show, if you want to get the last foot of life out of it. Of course, I took an oxygen bag. The man who goes for the altitude record without one will either be frozen or smothered, or both. I had a good look at the planes, the rudder bar, and the elevating lever before I got in. Everything was in order so far as I could see. Then I switched on my engine and found that she was running sweetly. When they let her go, she rose almost at once upon the lowest speed. I circled my home field once or twice, just to warm her up, and then with a wave to Perkins and the others, I flattened out my planes and put her on her highest. She skimmed like a swallow, downwind for 8 or 10 miles, until I turned her nose up a little and she began to climb in a great spiral for the cloud bank above me. It's all important to rise slowly and adapt yourself to the pressure as you go. It was a close, warm day for an English September, and there was the hush and heaviness of impending rain. Now and then there came sudden puffs of wind from the southwest, one of them so gusty and unexpected that it caught me napping and turned me half round for an instant. I remember the time when gusts and whirls and air pockets used to be things of danger, before we learned to put an overmastering power into our engines. Just as I reached the cloud banks with the altimeter marking 3,000, down came the rain. My word, how it poured! It drummed upon my wings and lashed against my face, blurring my glasses so that I could hardly see. I got down onto a low speed, for it was painful to travel against it. As I got higher, it became hail, and I had to turn tail to it. One of my cylinders was out of action, a dirty plug, I should imagine, but still I was rising steadily with plenty of power. After a bit, the trouble passed, whatever it was, and I heard the full, deep-throated purr, the 10 singing as one. That's where the beauty of our modern silencers comes in. We can at last control our engines by ear. How they squeal and squeak and sob when they're in trouble. All those cries for help were wasted in the old days, when every sound was swallowed up by the monstrous racket of the machine. If only the early aviators could come back to see the beauty and perfection of the mechanism which had been bought at the cost of their lives. About 9:30 I was nearing the clouds. Down below me, all blurred and shadowed with rain, lay the vast expanse of Salisbury Plain. Half a dozen flying machines were doing hack work at the 1,000-foot level, looking like little black swallows against the green background. I dare say they were wondering what I was doing up in Cloudland. Suddenly, a grey curtain drew across beneath me, and the wet folds of vapours were swirling round my face. It was clammily cold and miserable, but I was above the hailstorm, and that was something gained. The cloud was as dark and thick as a London fog. In my anxiety to get clear, I cocked her nose up until the automatic alarm bell rang, and I actually began to slide backwards. My sopped and dripping wings had made me heavier than I thought, but presently I was in lighter cloud, and soon had cleared the first layer. There was a second, opal-coloured and fleecy, at a great height above my head, a white, unbroken ceiling above, and a dark, unbroken floor below, with a monoplane labouring upwards upon a vast spiral between them. It is deadly lonely in these cloud spaces. Once a great flight of some small water-birds went past me, flying very fast to the westwards. The quick whir of their wings and their musical cry were cheery to my ear. I fancy that they were teal, but I am a wretched zoologist. Now that we humans have become birds, we must really learn to know our brethren by sight. The wind down beneath me whirled and swayed the broad cloud plain. Once a great eddy formed in it, a whirlpool of vapour, and through it, as down a funnel, I caught sight of the distant world. A large white biplane was passing at a vast depth beneath me. I fancy it was the morning mail service betwixt Bristol and London. Then the drift swirled inwards again, and the great solitude was unbroken. Just after 10, I touched the lower edge of the upper cloud stratum. It consisted of fine diaphanous vapour drifting swiftly from the westwards. The wind had been steadily rising all this time, and it was now blowing a sharp breeze, 28 an hour by my gauge. Already it was very cold, though my altimeter only marked 9,000. The engines were working beautifully, and we went droning steadily upwards. The cloud bank was thicker than I'd expected, but at last it thinned out into a golden mist before me, and then, in an instant, I had shot out from it, and there was an unclouded sky and a brilliant sun above my head, all blue and gold above, all shining silver below, one vast, glimmering plain as far as my eyes could reach. It was 10:15, and the barograph needle pointed to 12,800. Up I went and up, my ears concentrated upon the deep purring of my motor, my eyes busy always with the watch, the revolution indicator, the petrol lever, and the oil pump. No wonder aviators are said to be a fearless race. With so many things to think of, there is no time to trouble about oneself. About this time, I noted how unreliable is the compass when above a certain height from Earth. At 15,000 feet, mine was pointing east and a point south. The sun and the wind gave me my true bearings. I had hoped to reach an eternal stillness in these high altitudes, but with every 1,000 feet of ascent, the gale grew stronger. My machine groaned and trembled in every joint and rivet as she faced it, and swept away like a sheet of paper when I banked her on the turn, skimming downwind at a greater pace perhaps than ever mortal man has moved. Yet I had always to turn again and tack up in the wind's eye, for it was not merely a height record that I was after. By all my calculations, it was above Little Wiltshire that my air jungle lay, and all my labour might be lost if I struck the outer layers at some farther point. When I reached the 19,000-foot level, which was about midday, the wind was so severe that I looked with some anxiety to the stays of my wings, expecting momentarily to see them snap or slacken. I even cast loose the parachute behind me, and fastened its hook into the ring of my leathern belt, so as to be ready for the worst. Now was the time when a bit of scamped work by the mechanic is paid for by the life of the aeronaut. But she held together bravely. Every cord and strut was humming and vibrating like so many harp strings. But it was glorious to see how, for all the beating and the buffeting, she was still the conqueror of nature and the mistress of the sky. There is surely something divine in man himself that he should rise so superior to the limitations which creation seemed to impose, rise, too, by such unselfish, heroic devotion as this air conquest has shown. Talk of human degeneration! When has such a story as this been written in the annals of our race? These were the thoughts in my head as I climbed that monstrous inclined plane with the wind sometimes beating in my face and sometimes whistling behind my ears, while the cloudland beneath me fell away to such a distance that the folds and hummocks of silver had all smoothed out into one flat, shining plain. But suddenly I had a horrible and unprecedented experience. I have known before what it is to be in what our neighbors have called a tourbillon, but never on such a scale as this. That huge, sweeping river of wind of which I have spoken had, as it appears, whirlpools within it, which were as monstrous as itself. Without a moment's warning, I was dragged suddenly into the heart of one. I spun round for a minute or two with such velocity that I almost lost my senses, and then fell suddenly, left wing foremost, down the vacuum funnel in the center. I dropped like a stone, and lost nearly 1,000 feet. It was only my belt that kept me in my seat, and the shock and breathlessness left me hanging half insensible over the side of the fuselage. But I am always capable of a supreme effort. It is my one great merit as an aviator. I was conscious that the descent was slower. The whirlpool was a cone rather than a funnel, and I had come to the apex. With a terrific wrench, throwing my weight all to one side, I leveled my planes and brought her head away from the wind. In an instant I had shot out of the eddies and was skimming down the sky. Then, shaken but victorious, I turned her nose up and began once more my steady grind on the upward spiral. I took a large sweep to avoid the danger spot of the whirlpool, and soon I was safely above it. Just after 1 o'clock I was 21,000 feet above the sea level. To my great joy I had topped the gale, and with every 100 feet of ascent the air grew stiller. On the other hand, it was very cold, and I was conscious of that peculiar nausea which goes with rarefaction of the air. For the first time I unscrewed the mouth of my oxygen bag and took an occasional whiff of the glorious gas. I could feel it running like a cordial through my veins, and I was exhilarated almost to the point of drunkenness, I shouted and sang as I soared upwards into the cold, still, outer world. It is very clear to me that the insensibility which came upon Glacier, and in a lesser degree upon Coxwell, when in 1862 they ascended in a balloon to the height of 30,000 feet, was due to the extreme speed with which a perpendicular ascent is made. Doing it at an easy gradient and accustoming oneself to the lessened barometric pressure by slow degrees, there are no such dreadful symptoms. At the same great height I found that even without my oxygen inhaler I could breathe without undue distress. It was bitterly cold, however, and my thermometer was at 0 Fahrenheit. At 1:30 I was nearly 7 miles above the surface of the earth, and still ascending steadily. I found, however, that the rarefied air was giving markedly less support to my planes, and that my angle of ascent had to be considerably lowered in consequence. It was already clear that, even with my light weight and strong engine power, there was a point in front of me where I should be held. To make matters worse, one of my sparking plugs was in trouble again, and there was intermittent misfiring in the engine. My heart was heavy with the fear of failure. It was about that time that I had a most extraordinary experience. Something whizzed past me in a trail of smoke and exploded with a loud hissing sound, sending forth a cloud of steam. For the instant I could not imagine what had happened. Then I remembered that the earth is forever being bombarded by meteor stones, and would be hardly inhabitable were they not in nearly every case turned to vapor in the outer layers of the atmosphere. Here is a new danger for the high-altitude man, for 2 others passed me when I was nearing the 40,000-foot mark. I cannot doubt that at the edge of the Earth's envelope, the risk would be a very real one. My barograph needle marked 41,300 when I became aware that I could go no farther. Physically, the strain was not as yet greater than I could bear, but my machine had reached its limit. The attenuated air gave no firm support to the wings, and the least tilt developed into side-slip, while she seemed sluggish on her controls. Possibly, had the engine been at its best, another 1,000 feet might have been within our capacity. But it was still misfiring, and 2 out of the 10 cylinders appeared to be out of action. If I had not already reached the zone for which I was searching, then I should never see it upon this journey. But was it not possible that I had attained it? Soaring in circles like a monstrous hawk upon the 40,000-foot level, I let the monoplane guide herself, and with my Mannheim glass I made a careful observation of my surroundings. The heavens were perfectly clear. There was no indication of those dangers which I had imagined. I have said that I was soaring in circles. It struck me suddenly that I would do well to take a wider sweep and open up a new air tract. If the hunter entered an earth jungle, he would drive through it if he wished to find his game. My reasoning had led me to believe that the air jungle which I had imagined lay somewhere over Wiltshire. This should be to the south and west of me. I took my bearings from the sun, for the compass was hopeless, and no trace of earth was to be seen. Nothing but the distant silver cloud plain. However, I got my direction as best I might, and kept her head straight to the mark. I reckoned that my petrol supply would not last for more than another hour or so, but I could afford to use it to the last drop, since a single magnificent volplane could at any time take me to the earth. Suddenly I was aware of something new. The air in front of me had lost its crystal clearness. It was full of long, ragged wisps of something which I can only compare to very fine cigarette smoke. It hung about in wreaths and coils, turning and twisting slowly in the sunlight. As the monoplane shot through it, I was aware of a faint taste of oil upon my lips, and there was a greasy scum upon the woodwork of the machine. Some infinitely fine organic matter appeared to be suspended in the atmosphere. There was no life there. It was inchoate and diffuse, extending for many square acres and then fringing off into the void. No, it was not life. But might it not be the remains of life? Above all, might it not be the food of life, of monstrous life, even as the humble grease of the ocean is the food for the mighty whale? The thought was in my mind when my eyes looked upwards, and I saw the most wonderful vision that ever man has seen. Can I hope to convey it to you even as I saw it myself last Thursday? Conceive a jellyfish, such as sails in our summer seas, bell-shaped and of enormous size, far larger, I should judge, than the dome of St. Paul's. It was of a light pink colour veined with a delicate green, but the whole huge fabric so tenuous that it was but a fairy outline against the dark blue sky. It pulsated with a delicate and regular rhythm. From it there depended two long, drooping green tentacles, which swayed slowly backwards and forwards. This gorgeous vision passed gently with noiseless dignity over my head, as light and fragile as a soap bubble, and drifted upon its stately way. I had half turned my monoplane that I might look after this beautiful creature, when, in a moment, I found myself amidst a perfect fleet of them, of all sizes, but none so large as the first. Some were quite small, but the majority about as big as an average balloon, and with much the same curvature at the top. There was in them a delicacy of texture and colouring which reminded me of the finest Venetian glass. Pale shades of pink and green were the prevailing tints, but all had a lovely iridescence where the sun shimmered through their dainty forms. Some hundreds of them drifted past me, a wonderful fairy squadron of strange unknown argosies of the sky, creatures whose forms and substance were so attuned to these pure heights that one could not conceive anything so delicate within actual sight or sound of earth. But soon my attention was drawn to a new phenomenon, the serpents of the outer air. These were long, thin, fantastic coils of vapor-like material, which turned and twisted with great speed, flying round and round at such a pace that the eyes could hardly follow them. Some of these ghost-like creatures were 20 or 30 feet long, but it was difficult to tell their girth, for their outline was so hazy that it seemed to fade away into the air around them. These air snakes were of a very light grey or smoke colour, with some darker lines within, which gave the impression of a definite organism. One of them whisked past my very face, and I was conscious of a cold, clammy contact. But their composition was so unsubstantial that I could not connect them with any thought of physical danger any more than the beautiful bell-like creatures which had preceded them. There was no more solidity in their frames than in the floating spume from a broken wave. But a more terrible experience was in store for me. Floating downwards from a great height there came a purplish patch of vapour, small as I saw it first, but rapidly enlarging as it approached me, until it appeared to be hundreds of square feet in size. Though fashioned of some transparent jelly-like substance, it was none the less of much more definite outline and solid consistence than anything which I had seen before. There were more traces, too, of a physical organization, especially two vast, shadowy, circular plates upon either side, which may have been eyes, and a perfectly solid white projection between them, which was as curved and cruel as the beak of a vulture. The whole aspect of this monster was formidable and threatening, and it kept changing its colour from a very light mauve to a dark, angry purple so thick that it cast a shadow as it drifted between my monoplane and the sun. On the upper curve of its huge body there were 3 great projections, which I can only describe as enormous bubbles, and I was convinced as I looked at them that they were charged with some extremely light gas which served to buoy up the misshapen and semi-solid mass in the rarefied air. The creature moved swiftly along, keeping pace easily with the monoplane, and for 20 miles or more it formed my horrible escort, hovering over me like a bird of prey which is waiting to pounce. Its method of progression, done so swiftly that it was not easy to follow, was to throw out a long, glutinous streamer in front of it, which in turn seemed to draw forward the rest of the writhing body. So elastic and gelatinous was it that never for 2 successive minutes was it the same shape, and yet each change made it more threatening and loathsome than the last. I knew that it meant mischief. Every purple flush of its hideous body told me so. The vague, goggling eyes, which were turned always upon me, were cold and merciless in their viscid hatred. I dipped the nose of my monoplane downwards to escape it. As I did so, As quick as a flash there shot out a long tentacle from this mass of floating blubber, and it fell as light and sinuous as a whiplash across the front of my machine. There was a loud hiss as it lay for a moment across the hot engine, and it whisked itself into the air again, while the huge flat body drew itself together as if in sudden pain. I dipped to a vol peak, but again a tentacle fell over the monoplane and was shorn off by the propeller as easily as it might have cut through a smoke wreath. A long, gliding, sticky serpent-like coil came from behind and caught me round the waist, dragging me out of the fuselage. I tore at it, my fingers sinking into the smooth, glue-like surface, and for an instant I disengaged myself, but only to be caught round the boot by another coil, which gave me a jerk that tilted me almost onto my back. As I fell over, I blazed off both barrels of my gun, though indeed it was like attacking an elephant with a pea-shooter, to imagine that any human weapon could cripple that mighty bulk. And yet I aimed better than I knew, for with a loud report one of the great blisters upon the creature's back exploded with the puncture of the buckshot. It was very clear that my conjecture was right, and that these vast, clear bladders were distended with some lifting gas, for in an instant the huge cloud-like body turned sideways, writhing desperately to find its balance, while the white beak snapped and gaped in horrible fury. But already I had shot away on the steepest glide that I dared to attempt, my engine still full on, the flying propeller and the force of gravity shooting me downwards like an aerolite. Far behind me, I saw a dull, purplish smudge growing swiftly smaller and merging into the blue sky behind it. I was safe out of the deadly jungle of the outer air. Once out of danger, I throttled my engine, for nothing tears a machine to pieces quicker than running on full power from a height. It was a glorious spiral volplane from nearly 8 miles of altitude, first to the level of the silver cloud bank, then to that of the storm cloud beneath it, and finally, in beating rain, to the surface of the earth. I saw the Bristol Channel beneath me as I broke from the clouds, but, having still some petrol in my tank, I got 20 miles inland before I found myself stranded in a field half a mile from the village of Ashcombe. There I got 3 tins of petrol from a passing motor car, and at 10 minutes past 6 that evening I alighted gently in my own home meadow at Devizes, after such a journey as no mortal upon earth has ever yet taken and lived to tell the tale. I have seen the beauty, and I have seen the horror of the heights, and greater beauty or greater horror than that is not within the ken of man. And now it is my plan to go once again before I give my results to the world. My reason for this is that I must surely have something to show by way of proof before I lay such a tale before my fellow men. It is true that others will soon follow and will confirm what I have said, and yet I should wish to carry conviction from the first. Those lovely iridescent bubbles of the air should not be hard to capture. They drift slowly upon their way, and the swift monoplane could intercept their leisurely course. It is likely enough that they would dissolve in the heavier layers of the atmosphere, and that some small heap of amorphous jelly might be all that I should bring to earth with me. And yet something there would surely be by which I could substantiate my story. Yes, I will go, even if I run a risk by doing so. These purple horrors would not seem to be numerous. It is probable that I shall not see one. If I do, I shall dive at once. At the worst, there is always the shotgun, and my knowledge of... Here, a page of the manuscript is unfortunately missing. On the next page is written in large, straggling writing, 43,000 feet. I shall never see earth again. They are beneath me, 3 of them. God help me, it is a dreadful death to die. Such, in its entirety, is the Joyce Armstrong statement. Of the man nothing has since been seen. Pieces of his shattered monoplane have been picked up in the preserves of Mr. Bud Lushington upon the borders of Kent and Sussex, within a few miles of the spot where the notebook was discovered. If the unfortunate aviator's theory is correct, and this air jungle, as he called it, existed only over the southwest of England, then it would seem that he had fled from it at the full speed of his monoplane, but had been overtaken and devoured by these horrible creatures at some spot in the outer atmosphere, above the place where the grim relics were found. The picture of that monoplane skimming down the sky, with the nameless terrors flying as swiftly beneath it and cutting it off always from the earth while they gradually closed in upon their victim, is one upon which a man who valued his sanity would prefer not to dwell. There are many, as I am aware, who still jeer at the facts which I have here set down, but even they must admit that Joyce Armstrong has disappeared, and I would commend to them his own words. This notebook may explain what I am trying to do, and how I lost my life in doing it. But no drivel about accidents or mysteries, if you please.